you. I left it in the slots. What happened?
Welcome. I'm going to call to call to order the August 2nd, 2017 public hearing to consider two separate application requests. Before we begin, I'd like to invite you to rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. At this hearing, we will consider an application by Pacific Northwest Solar LLC affecting properties generally located along Southeast Dusk Road, Duus, near Estacada. This application before us consists of two separate requests. A reasons exception to the Statewide Planning Goal 3 Z0115-17-CP and a conditional use permit for construction operation of a photovoltaic solar power generation facility on approximately 7 acres of land that is zoned exclusive farm use Z0116-17-C. The hearing will proceed as following. First, hear from the staff presentation from the Senior Planner Martha Fritzie. The applicant will have up to 20 minutes to present. Next, I'll open the hearing for public testimony, beginning with public officials, who will have 5 minutes each. Then representatives from recognized community planning organizations and agencies will have 3 minutes. And finally, other people wishing to testify will have 3 minutes each. The board will then deliberate with either rendering a decision today or set a time to make a decision at a later date. Assisting us in the hearing today is our County Clerk, Kevin Moss, Senior Planner, Martha Fritzie, and Assistant County Counsel, Nate Boderman. If you wish to testify, please sign the sheet provided. If you have prepared written statement, please give Kevin a copy and use your time to summarize what you have written. Everyone who wishes to speak will have an opportunity to do so. We'll now begin with the hearing with a legal statement by Nate Boderman, Assistant County Counsel, followed by staff report, Martha Fritzie, Senior Planner.
Thank you. Good morning, Commissioners. This is the time set for the public hearings for the applications that the chair has already identified. This is a quasi-judicial land use hearing. That's a specific kind of hearing, which means two important things for those that wish to participate in the hearing this morning. First, all the criteria that can be used has been identified in the staff report. And so testimony, evidence, arguments, etc. That you may wish to present this morning must be directed towards the criteria identified in the staff report or that which you believe may be relevant to the application. To the extent possible, please direct your testimony to those relevant criteria. Second, failure to raise an issue accompanied by statements or evidence necessary to give the decision maker an adequate opportunity to respond may preclude appeal to the Oregon Land Use Board of Appeals on that particular issue. Failure of the applicant to raise constitutional or other issues related to proposed conditions of approval with sufficient specificity to allow the local government or its designee to respond to the issue precludes an action for damages in circuit court. Once final, this decision may be appealed to the Oregon Land Use Board of Appeals. At this time, I'll ask the Board of Commissioners to disclose any ex parte contacts, bias, or conflict of interest that you might have.
Nope. Seeing none.
Seeing none, if anybody wishes to challenge the impartiality of any commissioner, please clearly indicate your intention to do so in any written or oral testimony that you may provide today. So with that concludes the legal statement. I'll turn it over to Senior Planner Martha Fritzie.
Hi, good morning.
Morning.
I'm Martha Fritzie with the county's Planning and Zoning Division, and I am going to walk you through the staff report regarding Z0115-17 and Z0116-17. Before we start, there's 3 new exhibits that were put on your desks in front of you, Exhibits 17, 18, and 19. Exhibit 17 is a joint letter from the Department of Land Conservation and Development and the Oregon Department of Agriculture It largely mirrors what was said in DLCD's original letter, which I believe is Exhibit 14, either 13 or 14. But the distinction is the Oregon Department of Agriculture signed on to it, and I'll discuss one difference in the letter as I go through the presentation. Exhibit 18 is a response to a wetland delineation notice that we sent to Division of State Lands. It doesn't say a whole lot, except that the applicant needs to go through a permitting process with them. And then Exhibit 19 is the applicant's response to Exhibit 17. So moving on. As noted, we are here today to talk about a reasons exception to statewide planning goal to allow for a photovoltaic solar power generation facility, which is expected to generate up to 10 megawatts of electrical power. Per the administrative rules, if such a facility is to occupy more than 12 acres of high-value farmland, this goal exception is required. Along with that, to construct the facility, it requires a conditional use permit. The proposal is to encompass approximately 70 acres with single-axis tracking photovoltaic modules. It's expected to be an unmanned facility except for occasional maintenance and inspection visits. And you will be able to see a site plan up here shortly. The property is located on the north side of Southeast Duus Road, just north of Estacada. You see the red dotted line there is the urban growth boundary of the city of Estacada. The entire property is 72.69 acres, and it is zoned exclusive farm use. This is an aerial view of the property. It's currently undeveloped. There's no structures on it. It is not cultivated. It has, with the best evidence that we have, has not ever been cultivated for at least the last 20 years. It is predominantly high-value farmland soils and therefore must be treated as high-value farmland. And the entire property is relatively flat. You'll notice around the property there are a couple of large parcels. They're largely treed. There doesn't appear to be a lot of cultivation around there. There are a few houses immediately east of the property along Duus Road, and then one large house that looks like adjacent to the property. The site itself actually has an area in the northeast corner, a small area that's been mapped by Dagami as an historic landslide deposit area. Again, that area is not particularly steep. It's not something that's actually regulated under our zoning and development ordinance, although it's recommended always if you have a map landslide deposit that you do a geotechnical report before any development occurs. It's my understanding that the applicant is in the process of doing that right now. There's also a regulated waterway going across the southern portion of the property that is subject to Section 704 of our zoning ordinance, which would require additional permitting for stream crossings and a 50-foot setback for all structures, which has been identified in the applicant's site plan that they can meet those requirements. And interestingly, no wetlands were found on the county's inventory or national wetland inventory. However, the applicant did hire a firm to complete a wetland delineation, and the preliminary results show that there is a pretty sizable wetland on the property. And so the applicants are working with the Division of State Lands and with the Army Corps of Engineers for the appropriate permitting related to those areas on the property. This is the site plan. It's probably a little bit hard to see, but you can see the site's fairly rectangular. It is mostly covered it would be mostly covered with the photovoltaic solar modules. There's a couple of streams identified that they are avoiding. The stream going across the southern portion of the property is the one that has the required 50-foot setback under our zoning ordinance. And the access is over to the right-hand side of the property, and there'll be an access road going up the right and some turnarounds for fire vehicles. So moving on, there's a whole slew of relevant policies and criteria. I'm not going to read all of these to you. They're all discussed in detail in the Planning Commission staff report, and I'm going to go through a summary of a lot of this. It's a lot of information. And so I will do my best to make it as brief as possible and explain all of the relevant policies and criteria here. But first, before we start, why is a goal exception needed? Well, a subject property, as I noted, is designated agriculture on the comprehensive plan and is zone exclusive farm use. Section 401, which is the exclusive farm use section of the county's zoning and development ordinance, allows for photovoltaic solar power generation facilities as a conditional use, subject to the administrative rule that's listed up there. When you go look at that administrative rule, it stipulates that if a facility is to be sited on more than 12 acres of high-value farmland, it has to obtain this goal exception. And the proposal here, excuse me, here is for 70 acres. So therefore, it exceeds that threshold of 12 acres and needs a goal exception. So what is a goal exception? A goal exception is a very property-specific approval that can happen, and it applies to a specific property. It doesn't establish any policy. There's no general applicability. It has specific approval criteria in the administrative rules and the statutes, and you need to follow the process in order to get an exception to place a particular type of development on a property that doesn't necessarily comply with the goal, the statewide planning goal that would apply to that property. And in this case, it's statewide planning goal 3, which is agriculture. And there are 3 types of exceptions: a physically developed exception, which means the property's already been physically developed to such an extent you couldn't do what was intended. Obviously, that's not the case. The committed exception means surrounding properties are also developed and preclude you from doing what the property was intended for, and that is also not the case, and therefore we're left with the reasons exception, which is by far the most complicated. The reasons exception, you basically need to make 4 arguments. There's a need argument. You need to do an alternatives analysis to demonstrate that other areas that wouldn't require the goal exception couldn't accommodate the use. You need to look at the consequences the proposed use will have in relation to other locations it could go, and then the use needs to be deemed compatible with other adjacent uses or to be able to be rendered so through mitigation. So the need argument is the first one, and the applicant addressed both the general criteria that are listed in the administrative rule and criteria specific to rural industrial uses. This is sort of a complicated argument. It has been something that was discussed a lot at the Planning Commission hearing and is the subject of a lot of comments in the letters from DLCD 1000 Friends and the applicant. And essentially, the general criteria says that demonstrated need needs to be based on one or more of the requirements of statewide planning goals 3 to 19 and has special features or qualities that necessitate its location on or near the proposed exception site. And so statewide planning goal 13 stipulates, that's energy conservation, stipulates that we utilize renewable resources, including solar, whenever possible, and the need base basically that was argued by the applicant, my understanding of it is that Portland General Electric entered into a contract for this facility, and they would not have entered into this contract if there wasn't a need for this. Both federal and state regulations, to my understanding, have changed, and particularly in Oregon, the large power generation facilities are now required to meet increasing targets of using renewable energy for their retail electric customers, and they're required to remove coal-fueled energy generation from Oregon's energy rates by 2030. And so there is a need for more facilities like this in order to meet those goals. In addition, specifically, the Estacada substation was chosen because it has the capacity for this 10 megawatt facility, and in order to make it financially feasible to build a facility like this which is required to pay all of the connection costs. It needs to be located within a certain vicinity of the substation it's going to be connected to, which was identified as the applicants by, as 2 miles, which is roughly how far they are from the substation. And so that's my summary of the need base. I don't know if the applicant and or DLCD may elaborate on that, but it's staff's feeling that the evidence provided and the arguments related to the need for the facility have been met. And when you get into the rural industrial needs, there's some debate whether or not this is actually rural industrial development. The need-based arguments related to rural industrial really talk to significant competitive advantages and specific resource advantages, benefits to the county economy, and minimal loss to productive resource lands. And I guess in my mind, all of those arguments really tie back into the general argument that it has special features or qualities, there's a typo, or qualities that necessitate its location on or near the proposed site. And they all tie back into that argument, and so I don't want to get into a whole lot of debate about whether or not this is rural industrial. I'm not sure that that's necessary at this point, because we feel that the need-based argument under the general criteria has been met. And so moving on to the second one, the alternatives analysis, and I swear I won't talk that long on any of the other slides, but moving on to the alternatives analysis, the administrative rules state specifically that you don't need to address specific sites, rather areas in the vicinity. However, if somebody identifies specific, if somebody else identifies specific sites that they think are reasonable, then the applicant is required to also analyze those. And so both of those things happened. The standard is that these other areas and or sites cannot reasonably accommodate the use. And the rule sets out 3 areas to address. You need to look inside of urban growth boundaries, outside an urban growth boundary that would not require a goal exception, and in natural resource areas that are already committed, including in unincorporated communities. And in the initial analysis, the applicant identified a study area of 2 miles from the Estacada substation, a minimum lot size, and some other site criteria. It needs to be flat, and other required criteria that they would need for this type of facility. And they found that there are 20 sites or tracts within 2 miles of the Estacada substation with over 60 acres, and proceeded to analyze all of those. With respect to the properties that were inside the urban growth boundary, they found 2 large sites, but they're inside Estacada's urban growth boundary and they're zoned R1, which is a low-density residential zone, which wouldn't allow this type of a facility. And so they eliminated those from consideration, and there are 3 areas that were identified by DLCD in addition to those inside the urban growth boundary that would potentially be sites for this facility. And because those were identified, the applicant did need to address them. They are addressed in Exhibit 19 that you have, and they are addressed in, I'm not sure which exhibit it is. I believe it's Exhibit 15 or 16. That was the applicant's initial response. And in a nutshell, I think everybody has agreed at this point that Area 3 is not appropriate because it is an industrial area that was brought into the city with specific stipulations on it. And then Areas 1 and 2 are both inside the urban growth boundary. They both require the assembly of properties from multiple property owners. And Area 2 specifically is zoned R1 also, and it has recently come to our attention that it has been approved for subdivision for 300 units, and so, or 300 lots, and the remainder of it is owned by the school district, and they have a master plan for additional facilities there. And so that doesn't appear to be a reasonable alternative. And Area 1 is a pretty large area that contains some land that's exclusive farm use inside the UGB, some land that's zoned R1. It is all planned for residential development, and it's inside an acknowledged urban growth boundary that DLCD has acknowledged is the boundary that is intended for 20 years of urban development and urban growth. And so that property is all planned and acknowledged as R1, even though it's still zoned EFU. And so essentially, on top of assembling properties and finding some slopes on properties and impacting a lot more development, because all of those properties have some development on them, on top of that, taking 70 acres outside of out of Estacade's urban growth boundary that's slated to accommodate future population growth really potentially has some negative impacts on their urban growth boundary, and it does not seem to be a reasonable alternative either. And so that on top of the fact that this isn't really an urban use. This is 70 acres that would be producing about one job. And so siting it inside an urban growth boundary is a difficult prospect, and staff feels is not really an appropriate prospect, and certainly the sites that are identified are not reasonable alternatives. And so other sites that were identified outside the UGB that don't require a goal exception, there are none inside. There are none of appropriate size inside that 2 mile study area. And so those were eliminated. And then having to identify committed natural resource areas is a little awkward in this instance, because the administrative rules specifically require the goal exception based on soil types, and so whether or not the area is committed isn't, in this instance, particularly relevant. That said, there weren't any, and this property is not in or near any unincorporated communities. And so the alternatives analysis didn't find any other reasonable alternatives for the siting of this property. And so moving on to consequences, the standard is that the adverse environmental, economic, social, and energy impacts from the proposed use are no greater than if the use were to locate on another site requiring a goal exception. This is a pretty easy analysis, given the fact that the property itself contains no structures, contains relatively few trees that would need to be removed, although there are some, and it isn't now nor has in the recent past been an agricultural use. And furthermore, the size, orientation, and topography of this property has enabled the applicant to efficiently design the site to utilize a lower than average number of acres. And so, in other words, they're impacting potentially a smaller amount of land than if the site were configured differently. To get the same output, they would need to locate it on a larger piece of land if it wasn't situated exactly like this one. And then finally, the compatibility criteria. The proposed uses must be compatible with other adjacent uses or be able to be made so. Again, that's a pretty easy argument. This is a very passive use. It doesn't emit smells, sounds. There's very little traffic because, like I mentioned, it's unmanned. There's somebody that would be coming to the site, I believe, maybe once a month. The applicant's proposing to maintain a visual barrier along the street. Some existing vegetation would remain. And there's really no evidence to suggest that in general, a freestanding solar array would limit or impair surrounding farm or forest operations or even nearby residences. And furthermore, it should be noted that this is really a temporary use. This is on a 20 to 30-year lease. The facility after that time, because we're not actually changing the zoning of the property, we're just taking an exception to site the facility. At the end of the life of the facility, it is required to be removed, and the property is put back to its original state, or to this, I guess, current state. And so other relevant criteria related to the goal exception were assessed and looked at, including statewide planning goals 2, 3, and 13, which deal with land use and energy conservation and agriculture. And then also the county comprehensive plan goals and policies in chapters 3, 4, and 5. They were all, it's determined that this proposal did meet all of the relevant criteria in those areas. And so I'm going to move on now to the conditional use permit portion of this application. The conditional use permit, the criteria for the conditional use permit are outlined in the County Zoning and Development Ordinance, Section 1203. The very first one listed up here is that the use is listed as a conditional use in the zoning district. Well, as we mentioned, this is an EFU. It is listed as a conditional use, subject to the Administrative Rule 660-033-0130, sub 38. In addition to that rule requiring a goal exception, there's also some specific criteria that a photovoltaic solar generation facility has to meet, including a finding that there's no unnecessary impact to agricultural operations on the property. That one's pretty obvious, there aren't any. There are requirements for soil erosion plan, compaction, and weed control plans. Those can all be taken care of through conditions of approval, and they have actually submitted some of those plans already. And there are specific criteria for allowing the siting of facility on high-value farmland. And the criteria that they have addressed and met is that it would significantly reduce a project's ability to successfully operate if they were required only to put it on the low-value farmland on the property, because that's only about 10% of the property. And so they wouldn't be able to get the size of facility, obviously. And then it also requires that the applicant create a 1-mile study area and identify existing or approved similar facilities within that area. And if there are less than 48 acres, you don't need to do anything else. If there are more, there's other criteria. There are less than 48 acres within the 1-mile study area, and so that's done. And then the second criteria in the zoning and development ordinance requires that the characteristics of the site are suitable, including the size, shape, location, topography, existence of improvements. This site is suitable based on all of those criteria. As we discussed, it's flat, it's rectangular, it's within the distance identified in order to connect to the transmission lines and the substation. And I won't bore you to death and reiterate it, but it is suitable for the proposal. The next criteria, that it's consistent with Section 1007.09 of our zoning ordinance, that the safety of the transportation system is adequate. Section 1007.09 specifically exempts unmanned facilities like cell towers, is what it says, from concurrency. And so we have found that this property is exempt from concurrency. It's not going to generate very much traffic anyway, which I think is why they're exempt. And the engineering staff, as noted in Exhibit 7, has concluded that the safety of the system is adequate for this facility to be constructed. The next criteria for the conditional use permit is that the proposal will not alter the character of the surrounding area in a manner that substantially limits the ability of others to do, what they're allowed to do on their property. Again, it doesn't require it to have no impacts, but rather the impacts must not limit, impair, or preclude the use of adjacent properties. Again, this is a very passive use. It does not have a lot of impacts on other properties, and so it's pretty easy to find that it won't alter the character of the surrounding area. The next criteria is that the proposal satisfies the goals and policies of the comprehensive plan, and it does. I listed Chapter 11 up there also, which is really just process and coordination. All the appropriate processes and coordination that are required were followed in this case. And finally, Section 1203 requires that the development comply with any of the applicable requirements found in the 800 and 1000 sections of the Zoning and Development Ordinance. There are none in the 800 section that apply. Section 1000 is specific development standards, things like roads and circulation and hazards to safety, utilities concurrence, transportation concurrence. All of those sections were looked at, and this proposal is compliant with all the standards in those sections, and/or can be made so just with conditions of approval. And then Section 401, which is the exclusive farm use section of the zoning and development ordinance, delineates the required setbacks, and the applicant's site plan demonstrates that they can meet those setbacks. And again, there's a criterion there that talks about it won't force significant changes to surrounding farm and forestry practices, which we have found several times here that it's not going to do that. So the Planning Commission held a hearing on July 10th. The only testimony at that hearing was from DLCD staff. The main issues that were identified at that hearing were the need argument for the reasons exception, and then the alternative sites that were identified inside of Estacada's urban growth boundary. The Planning Commission recommended approval of these files. Subject to the recommended conditions of approval, it was a unanimous vote. And staff also recommends approval of both of these files, subject to the recommended conditions of approval. And that's it. That was a lot of information.
Any questions from the commissioners?
I was just going to have Martha repeat that back, but I think I'll pass.
That would be cruel.
So we have quite a bit of, quite a few. So what was Estacada? I know Estacada's got a project plan near this site. What were their, I was trying to find in all this paper what their comments were on this.
We
I know
haven't
it's
received-
outside the city.
Oh, we haven't received any comments from Estacada. And I'm not sure what project you're referring, are you talking about the subdivision?
Yeah,
So that's actually in the area that was identified as Area 2. It's right by the,
Close by.
it's just north of the school.
but it's pretty close by.
Well, yeah, I guess, relatively. It's a 300 and some odd unit subdivision.
Yeah. Yeah, we met with the mayor. He never mentioned this project, and he was also very excited about his project. So that was great to hear. Ken?
Was the boring CPO notified about this project, do you know? Because,
Boring CPO?
yes,
Long ways away.
No, this is in the, was it Eagle Creek Barton?
Yes.
CPO, and they were notified.
because a solar project came up under their meeting last night, and I was wondering if it was the same project or a different one.
I don't believe it was this one. They weren't notified unless somebody forwarded it to them. We also have, there are several smaller solar projects that are in various
Stages.
stages.
This was for
of
34
approval.
acres, so,
For 34 acres?
yeah, so, okay.
I'm not aware of that one because that one probably would require a goal exception. If it does not require a goal exception, then it's just a conditional use permit and it never comes to you all, it goes to the hearings officer.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, let's see. So now we will open the public portion, comment portion of the hearing, and first we will ask the applicant if the applicant would like to say anything. I assume he will. They're gonna need it.
Jumping the gun.
So introduce yourself. You must be Steve.
Correct. I'm Steve Schmidt. I'm with Pacific Northwest Solar, and I'm at 15270 Pear Valley Lane, Auburn, California.
Great.
I'd like to start by thanking staff for a very comprehensive review of all the technical and legal portions to go through. So we're going to limit most of our proposal just to kind of further introduce us and a little bit more of the details of the project. And then we look forward to any questions that you might have. So some background information on Pacific Northwest Solar. We've got extensive development and engineering experience in our team. We currently have over 400 megawatts of development experience among our team members and pipeline across the United States. And we work with a number of large financing institutions through the financing and development for these projects. We've developed a reputation as a flexible and creative developer. We recognize that every project has unique issues local to those projects and specific to that project. And our goal is always to try to find solutions to those that work in the specific area and for that specific project, rather than one-size-fits-all methods across all of our projects. And currently, we are working across the lower 48 states from Washington to Florida. Our management team has a pretty diverse background of experience, obviously solar-specific experience, but also civil engineering, environmental engineering, hydrology, legal, real estate, and real estate brokerage, so that we have a very well-rounded group leading the company. And so this is the Duus project site. This is a 10 megawatt AC photovoltaic solar project. As was shown earlier, it's located on the property just north of Southeast Duus Road. The contract for this facility is a wholesale power contract with Portland General Electric, and that is an avoided cost contract, and I'll get into a little bit more detail about what that means a little later in the presentation. And right now, we're currently anticipating to begin construction in late spring of 2018. So this is the site plan. This is the same one that was identified earlier in staff's presentation. The access to the facility is there kind of on the eastern end, along with the road that is admittedly a little bit difficult to see at the moment, but the access road moves up the east side of the project site, and there's a fire department turnaround at the northeast corner of the facility, and this layout has been approved by the Clackamas Fire Department. And you see also, you notice the 50-foot clearances from, there are 3 streams actually that were identified on the property, the 2 that are kind of in the middle of the array, and the 3rd one that is along the northern boundary of the project site. We're going to walk through quickly some of the benefits that we've identified to Clackamas County and the local community. We're anticipating a peak of around 100 to 200 jobs on site during construction, and we would anticipate that a lot of those jobs do come from the local community here. And oftentimes people do say that construction jobs are temporary jobs. Well, construction projects are temporary, but construction jobs are permanent. You simply go from project to project. And to the extent that there are people here in the construction industry, this would be a great opportunity for them to continue working on another project. Additionally, there's a lot of engineering, surveying, environmental, and other office jobs that are required to support the design and construction of this project. Also, obviously, equipment suppliers, material suppliers, and the service industry would receive a significant boost due to this project. It's estimated that there would be approximately $7 million in local spending during construction. During operations, as has been mentioned, this is primarily a passive facility, and that is one of its benefits, but it does then have a relatively low on-site employment. We'd anticipate about 1 to 2 full-time equivalent positions, which is primarily for panel washing and other maintenance operations, but it will not be on a weekly basis that we would anticipate someone needing to be on site. And it's estimated approximately $80,000 a year in local spending during the operational period of the project. Property taxes are another significant benefit. Right now, the property contributes about $100 or about $1,000 a year to the county. The project through the PILT program would be assessed a $70,000 a year payment to the county. And that is especially important because the project will have a very small draw on public resources. There's no sewer connection, there's no water connection. It's not going to require significant efforts from the police or the fire department or otherwise. So the $70,000 a year is nearly net, 100% net benefit to the county. Additionally, so the energy pricing, this is what's called, as I mentioned earlier, an avoided cost energy contract. And what that means is that this is the cost that PGE would have to pay anyway for the traditional power sources that they typically obtain power from. PGE gets a lot of its power from coal-fired plants in Montana. And part of what's going on here is that PGE is being required by the state to phase that out. And that's some of what was discussed earlier. So these costs that are in the contract, PGE had calculated, and the Public Utility Commission has approved through a public process for as PGE's cost of obtaining carbon-based power. And if renewable projects can produce power at that rate and be financially viable, then PGE is directed to enter into contracts with those projects. This is one of those, and that's where the cost, or that's where the pricing for the power in this project comes from. And that's a 20-year contract with PGE. And we also want to point out that then that also helps to stabilize long-term energy costs. As we've all seen, traditional power, based power sources can vary pretty significantly in relatively short periods of time, where this is a set price for the length of the contract. Some environmental benefits. Obviously, the project is going to produce 10 megawatts of clean, renewable electricity, and that power will be used locally in Clackamas County. Electricity is the way that the grid works is the electricity flows to the closest demand from where it's interjected into the grid. So from the point that this project is interconnected right there on Southeast Duus Road, that energy will immediately begin being pulled out for the uses along the way as it works down to the Estacada substation and then be used basically in the Estacada area. So it really will provide renewable energy for the area. And it'll equate to approximately 6,000 tons of CO2 emissions being offset from the energy that's generated. And that's enough to power approximately 1,600 homes. So some of the questions and concerns that have been brought up, visibility of the project is one that was addressed earlier as well. The project equipment is approximately 6 feet in height. That's the equipment and the surrounding fence. And the existing vegetation that exists there is what we're proposing to leave in place at an elevation to screen those views into the project. And those plants are primarily evergreen trees and shrubs that would ensure a consistent barrier. Noise generated, there's very little noise. It's a passive facility, very few actual moving parts. It's what's called a single-axis tracking facility. So the panels do rotate on one axis to follow the sun across the sky during the day, but they're obviously moving very slowly in doing that. The only real moving parts are with the inverters, and those are located more central to the facility, really such that there is very little noise that is audible at the edges of the project. And now addressing some of DLCD's comments, and we certainly look forward to some more questions on these if necessary. But primarily the question about the demonstrated need, and we had addressed that earlier with PGE's need for this energy as identified by the state legislature and the Public Utility Commission directing them to enter into the contract with us for the power for this facility. And that is essentially to help to continue the process to offset traditional power with clean renewable power. And then also addressing the rural industrial development. We do believe it is a viable rural industrial development. It does produce a product that is electricity, and that product is wholesaled to PGE for resale to the general public, which generally meets the definition of industrial development per Clackamas County. And the alternatives analysis, I think, was pretty clearly addressed by staff earlier, and there was a question about whether the city had been contacted. We did reach out to the city to discuss this, and what they made clear to us is, as discussed earlier, Area 2 has a residential subdivision plan for it for most of the area. The remaining area is used up by the school. Area 1, we discussed with them the possibility of, if we were to remove some of the R1 land from that use into an industrial use. And from review of the comprehensive plan and discussions with the city, they indicated they only currently have approximately 18 acres of excess R1 land based on their current growth projections. And obviously our facility would use more than that 18 acres, and so it really does not appear to be a viable option for the project. And that's really the end of our initial comments, and look forward to any questions that you might have for us.
Any questions?
Not at this point.
I just have a question on
Sure.
what kind of security and what kind of fence.
So it's a 6-foot chain link fence, and that's required by federal energy guidelines with a single strand of barbed wire around the top. And for basically energy facilities such as this, that's the minimum requirement.
Okay, just want to make sure it wasn't razor wire or something like
It's
that.
not razor wire, yeah.
Doesn't look like a prison.
No, it does not look like a prison, and that fence will be, the landscaping will be outside of that fence.
Okay, great. All right, well, with that, we'll move on to, I've got one more person, Tim Murphy. And I assume you're just individual?
Actually, I'm with the Department of Land Conservation and
Oh, okay,
Development.
great.
So for the record, I'm Tim Murphy, Farm and Forest Land Specialist, DLCD 635 Capitol Street Northeast, Suite 150, Salem, Oregon. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, for the opportunity to talk with you today about this issue. I do want to start by just housekeeping. Our latest letter was dated July 27th, and as your staff mentioned, that was signed by us and the Department of Agriculture. We had provided some previous letters, but that letter adequately sums up our position. And I do also want to say that we absolutely support renewable energy development. However, we are concerned about where renewable energy is sited. We're increasingly seeing applications for solar on high-value farmland, which is very concerning to us. We have specifically designed our rules to try to encourage development away from those areas. For example, on the least productive soils for agricultural use, you can site a facility up to 320 acres without a goal exception, whereas on high-value farmland, you're limited to 12 acres. But nonetheless, we're seeing more and more exception applications, and we feel that we should comment on them. Just want to clarify regarding the need for the project. You can make your findings either based on Goal 13 or rural industrial. It doesn't have to be both. I just want to make sure that was clear. As far as Goal 13, energy conservation, and that goal really addresses how energy should be dealt with in local planning efforts. However, it does not address siting of any additional energy facilities. The need that needs to be based for this project needs to be based on Goal 13, and not what works for the applicant with their project, not what works for PGE, and not what is in the state energy plan. We feel that Goal 13 is consistent with Goal 3, which is agricultural lands, and also the state's agricultural land policy in ORS 215-243, which calls for the maximum preservation of the maximum amount of agricultural land. The way Goal 13 has been interpreted here is that it essentially trumps other planning goals, and we don't feel that that is consistent with the rest of our goals. Basically, using some of this criteria, if you're so desired, you could site a solar facility almost anywhere. Regarding rural industrial, we have our doubts as to whether or not this is adequately characterized as a rural industrial use, particularly given the post-construction employment projections. However, the county does have a rural industrial definition, or I'm sorry, an industrial definition in your code, and the county may interpret their own code. Regarding the alternatives analysis, we had identified a couple areas within the urban growth boundary. We received an email from the applicant with some additional information last night at 8:54. We have not had adequate time to review that information. However, in fairness to the applicant, I will say that the information that they provided referencing previous commitments of land and addressing local planning efforts is the type of information that we had discussed with them might be appropriate a couple weeks ago. I also just want to mention that we're not convinced that this is a temporary use. 30 years is a long period of time. This is perhaps a clumsy comparison. If somebody wanted to convert single-family residential to multifamily residential for 30 years, that would probably not be viewed as a temporary use. Also, we understand that the applicant has stated that the land can be remediated, and we're not going to dispute that. But there has not been information provided, largely due to solar technology being relatively new. In closing, I just want to say we're not convinced that this constitutes a significant comparative advantage over other substations. While the applicant has to do a lot of work to identify one of these sites that might work for them, there are other substations that could potentially accommodate the project without the need for a gold exception. And with that, I will close and appreciate any questions. Thank you for your time.
Any questions? Seeing none. Anyone else want to speak on this issue? I don't have any other. You need to sign up, but go ahead. You have 3 minutes.
Paul Edgar, Oregon City. Thank you. I think this is actually a very good application. From what I looked it over earlier, and golly, we got a power dam right up the road. We got running power lines directly through this area, and it's kind of like, it's almost like a concurrency statement. We've already got a lot of infrastructure that adapts easily to this, and we really need to be able to provide some alternative sources. My only concern of anything is that I hope that a lot of the material is American-made. Thank you.
All right. With that, we'll close the public hearing and discuss this issue. Who wants to start? It looks like Ken's up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I find myself in an interesting position in that I've been a very strong advocate for the protection of EFU farmland, and we're sitting here with what I consider to be conflicting positive values around which we need to make a decision. The persuasive arguments for me are, one, that this is land that has not been used for farming in at least 20 years. It isn't as if it's had a crop that's lying fallow for a year or two and then is going to go back into production. And I certainly would be opposed to the applicant's position if this was actually active, useful farmland. But it hasn't been for 20 years. The other issue to me is that the state and many of us individually have supported the idea of getting off of coal-fired power plants. We can't say that we want to be off of coal-fired power plants and other carbon-based fuels for power and then turn around and hamstring the very companies that are going to produce the alternative. So at this particular time, and because of those circumstances, I would find myself in a position of supporting the applicant. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So one of my concerns is that there are going to be a number of applicants. So if we approve this one today, how does that impact future applicants? doesn't, or?
Well, each of these is unique, and you have to analyze each specific site against all of the reasons exception criteria. And so, and Nate clicked on his microphone and probably has something more intelligent to say, but they're each unique projects. And I think that you will be seeing a few more of them, and I know that we are right now seeing a lot of the smaller ones that don't require goal exceptions that are locating on anywhere from 9 to 18 acres of farmland that are high value, low value, may or may not be in production. And so we're seeing a lot of the smaller ones already.
Well, I mean, in the urban rural reserve process, there were some areas that were reserved because they were farmland, but not high-value farmland. Pete's Mountain is the one that I think about, which is really not adequate for farming, really rocky, steep, and certainly I don't know what the requirements are for solar. I'm actually looking at solar on 2 of my barns, so I'm very interested in that. But I have some concerns about reduction of high-value farmland. And LCDC, 1,000 Friends, everyone else seems to have many of the same concerns. And I, like Ken, find this one to be kind of a very big challenge because I oppose taking our high-value farmland, whether it's in use or not, doesn't matter because, as we reduce the high-value farmland, eventually this may be an area that will be farmed. And since it has good, I assume the soils are pretty good, I feel challenged on this one in particular. And especially since 2 important groups, 1,000 Friends and Department of Land Conservation Development, it looks like, can they appeal themselves? Or does somebody else, they can, okay. That, it concerns me that they'll appeal this application. And then it'll be back in our, back for us to make another decision. So I'd like to hear from the rest of you guys. What do you think?
I actually think it's one of the best applications I've ever seen. I think that we are, it becomes very necessary to balance all those values. I think it's a low-impact use on ag land. And if we don't allow these facilities to be sited in spots that sometimes may be ag land, and I'm a farmer, by the way, or have been a farmer. I'm in an urban environment now. We're not going to be able to meet our energy goals. And for me, the whole notion of global warming, this whole notion of carbon reduction is important enough that I am in support of this application. And if it gets appealed, so be it, because perhaps what we need to have is a larger conversation about those 2 values and how we're going to balance that, how we're going to get clean energy to a grid versus having crops. Much like Commissioner Humbertson, if it hasn't been farmed in 20 years, at this point, I suspect we need to have, what better use would there be but farming clean energy is how I look at it. You know, when you think about agriculture, somebody described it to me once as being an industry without walls. And there is an industry component to solar energy and to agriculture, even if you have a small family farm, because it's work and it's tools and it's energy input. So I'm in support of this. I really appreciate the solid work staff did. I think that it was, it pretty delineates everything, and I think it's something that LCDC and the ag community and 1,000 Friends needs to start seriously grappling with, because we have to get clean energy from somewhere.
Okay, Paul?
Well, I couldn't help but reflect on a number of things where we find ourselves somewhat conflicted, and recalling back to some of the virtues of what Tom McCall and others have stood for on land use, and knowing as far as agriculture, primarily for, you know, the Oregon and actually farm use in the country and the world, that is being the breadbasket of the part of our land use that we provides the food, and that's been, you know, and I've always advocated for productive use of farmland, not just farmland for sake of having farmland, but the productive use of farmland. And primarily, when I always said that, I always meant that for basically food. But where we find ourselves conflicted, I think, is that a lot of these concerns weren't really raised during the marijuana discussion, and that's gobbled up far more land than 70 some odd acres, and not for food. And oddly enough, we find ourselves in a very growing population where our power grid is now being challenged, on the West Coast especially, as more and more people move here, but even more so now because of these marijuana farms are very power-intensive industries. So oddly enough, and unfortunately, I think that indeed some of the concerns I heard expressed by my colleagues here about, you know, here's one and there's probably another and there's probably another. This won't be the first solar array, you know, in the county. I can think of a couple already that are already out there. So I am sensitive to all those concerns, but at the same token I look at this as infrastructure, and we are stuck, you know, conflicted in some of our goals and aspirations, but therefore this is infrastructure necessity, and power, especially today for people running their air conditioners. It's incredibly important, and can actually be the difference between life and death. So power is important, but this is not an attractive use of the land. I'll say that.
Yeah, and just one further comment, you know, my little 6 acres hadn't been used in 20 years either. That's because they were very old. And it was, you know, her husband had died 20 years before, so it sat without use for many years. And it's high-value farmland too, but yeah, this is very conflicting. Well, with that, if there's no further discussion, I'll call for a vote on the motion. Will the clerk please take the roll?
There was no motion.
Oh, wait, there wasn't a roll, motion, was there? So I entertain a motion.
Just trying to find
Give me a moment here.
Page 4.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I move to approve Z0115-17-CP and Z0116-17C as recommended by Planning Commission and staff.
I'll second that.
It's been moved and seconded to approve Z0115-17-CP and Z0116-17C as recommended by the Planning Commission and staff. Any further discussion? So now I think I'm supposed to ask the clerk to please take the roll.
Certainly can, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Hubbardson.
Aye.
Commissioner Fisher.
No.
Commissioner Savas.
Aye.
Commissioner Schrader.
Aye.
Chair Bernard.
No. Motion passes 3-2. All right, let me see, I gotta read this stuff. Second, further discussion, is there any further discussion? Okay, now that the amendments have been approved, I will direct staff to draft an ordinance reflecting today's decision, including it on the agenda for the board's adoption in a future business meeting. We'll close the hearing on Z0115-17CP and Z0116-17C. Thank you. Let's see. With that, we have another hearing. Pardon? Yes.
Can I have a minute to switch out the tapes and then
Okay.
you start?
Okay.
Trying to figure out if my paperwork included the next hearing.
Yeah, that's what I did too.
So this meeting is adjourned.
Yeah.
This hearing is adjourned.
I just didn't do this.
So people out there in the audience know.
I'm with this.
That was interesting. Good for us. Oh, thanks, Jeff. Oh, yes.
That happened yesterday.
Yeah, it's next.
Okay, I don't have a script.
It might be included in the second one. It's in here. It's just the second one. Page,
Thank you.
so is this in the packet on page 6? Oh, that's, oh, no, that's the motion to continue. So, I saw it, just a lot of,
So let me grab the other.
here we are. Okay, so, oh yeah, I gotta wait for you to record it. All right, so we're on to the next hearing today, August 2nd, 2017, and that's ZDO 267. I'll now call to order the August 2nd public hearing to consider a legislative text amendment to the Clackamas County Comprehensive Plan, Zoning and Development Ordinance to provide for a new land use transitional housing communities. Before we begin, I'd like to invite you to rise and join me in a pledge of allegiance. Twice in one meeting. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Today, we will consider a ZDO 267, a legislative text amendment to provide for new transitional shelter community use in Clackamas County Comprehensive Plan and Zoning and Development Ordinance. The hearing on ZDO 267 will proceed as follows. We'll first hear from staff. Next, I'll open the hearing for the public testimony, beginning with public officials who will have 5 minutes. Then representatives from the recognized community planning organizations and agencies will have 3 minutes. Finally, other people wishing to testify will have 3 minutes each. The board will then deliberate and either render a decision today or set a time to make a decision at a later date. Assisting us in the hearing today is our clerk, Kevin Moss, Assistant County Counsel Nate Boderman, and I see you're there.
I am.
And Jennifer, I want to say Hughes.
That's right.
Jennifer Hughes, and you are a
Principal planner.
principal planner. If you wish to testify, please sign the sheet provided. And I don't have that yet, but Kevin's had that out there. If you have any prepared or written statements, please give us a copy, give Kevin a copy, and use your time to summarize what you have written. Everyone who wishes to speak will have an opportunity to do so. We'll now hear from our principal planner Jennifer Hughes.
You were just a little bit ahead.
Yeah.
Okay. So we are here for the purpose of considering file ZDO 267 related to transitional shelter communities. According to the most recent study, houselessness is increasing in Clackamas County. As part of the county's housing strategy, the Board of Commissioners initiated amendments to the county's land use regulations to provide for transitional shelter communities. Currently, the county's zoning and development ordinance does not permit this type of residential use in any of our zoning districts. The goal of transitional housing is to move houseless people up the housing continuum to a more sustainable, long-term option. So in other words, transitional housing is not intended to be a permanent housing solution for any particular resident, but to be something that is transitional. Just to provide some context, and this is really based on a lot of the testimony that the Planning Commission received, as the board is aware and as the public is aware, the county is considering the potential development of a transitional shelter community on a county-owned site on 115th Avenue. We would be partnering with a nonprofit to provide that service for veterans. However, there is no specific development proposal that has been submitted to the county so far for that site, and testimony and deliberation today really should focus on the text amendments to the comprehensive plan and the zoning and development ordinance. It's true, however, that these text amendments are required in order to pave the way for any potential development on the 115th site, so it's understandably difficult to separate the two. I will say my expertise here today is really in the amendments to the code that are being proposed, but if there are questions that you have regarding this specific project, I believe some staff from Department of Health, Housing, and Human Services was intending to be here today and might be able to respond then to those questions better than I could. The other thing the Planning Commission heard testimony about was really on the county's overall housing strategy. From proponents of this application, they heard, this is great, but it's not enough. And so I just want to be clear, this is not the only element that the county is considering under its larger houselessness strategy, but it is the only element that's under consideration today. So specifically, the proposal includes legislative text amendments to the comprehensive plan and zoning and development ordinance, the purpose of which is to provide a pathway for the development of transitional housing in the county. The proposal as drafted would amend comprehensive plan chapters 4 and 6, so those are the ones that address land use and housing. Would also amend zoning and development ordinance sections 202, which is the definitions section, 602, which regulates the county's industrial zoning districts, 1203, which regulates conditional uses generally, and it would also adopt a new ZDO Section 842 with regulations specific to transitional shelter communities. The proposal that you have in your materials today and that we're considering does reflect the Planning Commission's recommendations. So the amendments that they asked to have made to the staff proposal are incorporated in what you have in your materials. The proposal would adopt a definition of transitional shelter communities with 4 key elements: that these communities are temporary shelter for houseless people, that they are operated by an entity approved by the County Department of Health, Housing, and Human Services, informally known as H3S, that residents under 18 are prohibited, and that these communities may but are not required to provide support services. So for example, in addition to providing housing, they could be providing food or clothing or other types of supportive social services to the residents of the community. The proposal would permit transitional shelter communities as a conditional use in the county's light industrial and general industrial districts. These are urban industrial zones, so we would not be talking about having these in rural areas. Generally, the light industrial and general industrial districts are found in the Johnson Creek Boulevard area, near the Milwaukee Expressway, on both sides of Highway 212, and near Rothy Road, west of McLaughlin. The proposal is to implement standards for transitional shelter community development, such as, and I'll get into this in a little more specifics in a moment, but shelter unit type and size, utilities, storage, fencing, setbacks, and structure separation. We would waive requirements for the design review application that typically applies in industrial zones, so a conditional use permit would be required, but no separate design review application would be required. We would be waiving some of our general development standards, such as building design, street lighting, and off-street parking, with the understanding that we are attempting to sort of lower the threshold for the cost of developing this service, because there really isn't a profit motive here. It's difficult to find funding for these things, so the idea is to kind of lower the overall cost burden to establishing one. And in addition, because there's a sense that these may be temporary on industrial sites, the less infrastructure sort of devoted specifically to that use, the better. That would be the theory. In addition, the proposal is to sunset, or in other words, repeal, the ZDO provisions in 2 years or following the approval of 3 transitional shelter communities. And I'm going to circle back to that in a little more detail in a moment. So drilling down a little more into the specifics of the standards for the communities, we're proposing a 200 square foot maximum per shelter unit. The shelter units can be prefabricated or site-built, but could not be fabric. So the Planning Commission felt strongly no tents, yurts, what the building code calls membrane structures, would be permitted. Common kitchen and bathroom facilities would be required and would not be permitted in the individual shelter units. Storage space would be required for residents' belongings, and no outdoor storage permitted. Limited utilities would be allowed in the individual shelter units. For example, they could have electricity, but they could not have natural gas, sanitary sewer, or water service. Again, no individual kitchens or bathrooms. Fencing of the site would be required, minimum 6 feet high, site obscuring. Minimum 10-foot separation between the shelter units so that they wouldn't be able to sort of be like right on top of each other. In other words, they'd have to be laid out with some separation. Minimum lot line setbacks of 5 feet if they're abutting industrial or commercial zones, 35 feet if abutting residential zoning. And we do have some places where industrial zones do abut residential in the county. So significant issues, and when I say significant issues, this doesn't reflect all of the public testimony that you've received. You have a number of exhibits in your packet, but these were really the issues that the Planning Commission focused on in their deliberations. The first one, to what degree should the ZDO regulate who may operate a transitional shelter community? So there were several options that the Planning Commission talked about, one being don't regulate it. Could be public, private, for-profit, nonprofit, just sort of stay out of it and let anyone operate it who would want to. Second option, limit to an entity approved by H3S. This is what the Planning Commission has recommended, and I would characterize this as a strong recommendation from the Planning Commission. There was a lot of discussion about it. Essentially, the Planning Commission wanted a mechanism to allow the county to evaluate issues that are really difficult to deal with in a land use context. So we're used to dealing with things like landscaping and parking and traffic and setbacks. But it's kind of what I would call the sort of the softer issues, if you will. You know, how do you deal with how these transitional shelter communities are governed? Is it self-governance? What's the model for that? Does the operator really have the capacity to run one of these, both financial and experience and service delivery? How do you address things like on-site management? To what degree should an on-site manager be required? Should there be what essentially amounts to a curfew? Some of these type of village models do have, everybody's got to be in by a certain time, so almost sort of hours of operation, if you will. Those things don't lend themselves very well to a land use regulation, but the Planning Commission really felt that H3S, because that's sort of what they do, housing, one of the things they do, that they would have the capacity to kind of address those issues through a separate process. And so the definition of transitional shelter community as proposed would limit it to an entity approved by H3S. And then finally, because frankly, planning staff wasn't sure whether those standards from H3S were going to be something H3S was willing to undertake. And to be honest with you, I'm not sure what the status is. Right, the last I heard was that they were working on them and we're hoping to have something shortly. So assuming they're willing and able to do that, then that sort of resolves staff's concern. However, we offered the Planning Commission a third option in the event that the H3S model didn't work, and that was to require a government role for these transitional shelter communities, either in the form of the site being government owned, the transitional shelter community being government operated, or some sort of government funding. The Planning Commission kicked around a minimum of maybe $100,000, with the theory being that if there's a government role, essentially a public role, then we have the ability, or whatever level of government could be the state, or would have some authority over how these are run. Similar to what the county would have on this one for the grant that you're considering for the Veterans Project. Another significant issue, should the ZDO limit the duration of any of the following? So the Planning Commission talked about whether the occupancy of a transitional shelter community by any particular resident should be limited. Right now the definition just says temporary, but it does not attempt to define what temporary is. The negative, obviously, is that it's a little bit vague. The positive is that you're not evicting anybody on what could potentially be an arbitrary standard. Planning staff heard from H3S staff that some people it's more difficult to transition certain people to permanent housing. You could have a transition plan that derails for some reason, and they didn't really want to be in the position of having to sort of toss somebody out when maybe there was a good reason why they needed to stay a little bit longer. Second issue, should we limit the duration of the existence of a transitional shelter community on a particular site? So for instance, make it a temporary permit. The Planning Commission did not opt to go in that direction, so as drafted, it could stay there indefinitely. And then finally, should the ZDO provisions that actually permit these communities sunset at some point? And the answer to that from the Planning Commission's perspective was yes. They wanted essentially to treat this as a pilot project, if you will. Let's see where we are after 2 years or after the approval of 3 projects. And at that point, if there were unintended consequences or if we felt that we were losing too much industrial land to this use, we could just simply allow the provisions to be repealed. Alternatively, if we think it's working well or we haven't had a run on these in the first 2 years, then the board could extend those. We'd have to do another text amendment essentially to remove or change the sunset provision. Planning Commission also recommended a 2-year implementation period for an approved project. Normally an approved conditional use can take 4 years to start getting their permits, their development permits, and then have a 2-year extension. And the Planning Commission wanted just 2 years. And then in addition, the permit would be voided if the use ceased for more than a year. So essentially the conditional use wouldn't just kind of follow with the land indefinitely. Ordinarily it's a 5-year period for other conditional uses, but they wanted to reduce that to 1 year for these. Should residents under the age of 18 be allowed? The staff proposal was to allow with a legal guardian. The Planning Commission recommended a prohibition on that. And I am actually going to turn to Nate Boderman right now to just sort of weigh in on this. We had a question about whether the county could lawfully restrict based on age.
Yeah, and as Jennifer suggested, the issue with this is really whether a discriminatory admission policy would be allowed under state and federal law, and more specifically, the Fair Housing Act. Right? And so at its most basic level, a blanket prohibition on children would really have the effect of discriminating against families, right? And that's one of the protected classes under state and federal law. And I say that understanding that I think we're all familiar with certain facilities that currently have facially discriminatory admission policies. I think, again, all familiar with men-only shelters, perhaps women-only shelters, shelters that, or housing facilities that cater to certain segments of the population. And so I don't say that because they are per se legal, but I say that because under the current construct of the law, I think it's more accurate to characterize them as being tolerated in many instances. Discriminatory admissions policies may not violate the Fair Housing Act where there's legitimate and compelling safety concerns, for instance, based on the particular individuals involved. And this is actually a fairly high bar, and we can talk about this more if you have questions. But for instance, we are in a circuit court district that's recently called into question whether male and female only shelters violate the Fair Housing Act. And so again, it's somewhat of a pending question, but the unfortunate reality is that there isn't a whole lot of case law to help us make this determination to find that line. And even more unfortunate, I think there's not much litigation that's been filed by or on behalf of houseless individuals, really to enforce and delineate those housing rights. And so what I'd say is that if you're inclined to adopt the Planning Commission's recommendation on this, it may be subject to challenge. We just don't know. But staff's initial suggestion, of course, was to limit it to minors as long as they had legal guardians, because we know that parental supervision has been found to be a legitimate safety consideration, one that could support a policy that restricted unaccompanied minors from being admitted. But again, if the board would like to investigate further and run with the Planning Commission's recommendation prohibiting all minors, we would want to build in some very specific findings and recommendations to justify those safety concerns.
Thank you. And then the fourth issue, the Planning Commission really wanted staff to stress to the board is that they had some concerns about transportation. They did not end up recommending any zoning and development ordinance requirements related to this, but they were very concerned about access to transit as a key issue for this type of facility. And directed staff to convey to the board the importance of considering the availability of some form of transit that could potentially be done as part of this recommended H3S approval process for transitional shelter community operators. You certainly could put a standard in the zoning and development ordinance. I mean, transportation issues are something that does fall squarely within the land use realm. The question there, though, is how you would craft that. It would need to be, I think, relatively specific in terms of what the minimum threshold is. Do they need to be within a certain distance of a transit stop? Does service need to be at some certain level of frequency? Could the operator provide for perhaps a shuttle service as an alternative to that? So if there's some interest in that, we can certainly talk about some potential approaches to that issue. So the Planning Commission recommendation was approval of staff's draft of ZDO 267 by a vote of 8-0 with the following changes. Prohibit residents under the age of 18, allow operation only by an entity approved by H3S, sunset the new ZDO provisions after 2 years or the approval of 3 shelter communities, require implementation of an approved conditional use for a shelter community within 2 years, and void the conditional use if the shelter community use ceases for more than 1 year. All of those changes, as I said, are in the draft. Staff's recommendation at the time we wrote the staff report, it's changed just slightly, it was approval of ZDO 267 as recommended by the Planning Commission, with the exception that if H3S does not have a plan in place to evaluate shelter community operators, we would recommend that option that requires government involvement. So government-owned site, government operation of the transitional shelter community, or government funding of at least $100,000. In addition, I think you heard from Nate, we have some concerns about the prohibition on under 18, so we would either want to build in the findings he mentioned or simply revert back to the staff draft, which would allow residents under 18 with a legal guardian. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about the sunset clause. So I think staff is safe to say that Nate and I are more comfortable with the idea of a date certain for when this sunsets. So whether it's 2 years, 1 year, 6 months, I mean, what that really means, first of all, for sunsetting is that the regulations get repealed. It doesn't mean that if one of these communities is approved, that the approval goes away. If it's out there on the site, it can continue to exist. It becomes a non-conforming use. It enjoys substantial protections under county regulations to continue to have that use on the site. It also, if their land use application is submitted, and it's complete within 6 months of submittal, they can proceed. So even though the regulations go away, they're protected. So you could keep that all in mind if you're wanting to set a certain time limit for the sunset clause. The Planning Commission's alternative was that we would sunset it after the approval of 3 projects. That sounds really simple, but it isn't. When you start talking about what is approval, was it appealed? 3 people submitted an application on the same day. I mean, or one provider said, I've got 3 sites identified, and they submit them all, and we've already got one out there. Essentially, we would, under state law, have to consider any complete application that was filed, regardless of whether more than 3 of them had come in. They would be protected. But anyway, it becomes a challenge to write the language, but we can do it. If it's not that we're saying it can't legally be done. We're just saying it's going to take a little bit of finessing the language, and we would want to do something a little more specific than just saying the approval of 3 projects. And then you would just have to recognize that in theory, if there was a real push for these types of projects, you could end up with more than 3 depending on the timing of when the applications were filed. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Any questions of staff?
Not at this time.
I have a comment, but I don't have any, I have a comment, but I don't have a question at this time. And that is, I just want to speak to the issue of what the commission is doing. And I've read, as of this morning at 8 o'clock was in my hand, I read every submitted piece of testimony or concern or email, as well as everything that the Planning Commission heard. And it's knowing that some of the Planning Commission members that I had talked to, they had, 4 meetings on this, right?
Yes,
4
2 study
times.
sessions and 2
And
hearings.
they had their reservations on this, and I thought it was definitely end up being a split vote, and possibly not knowing which way it would go. But fortunately, they did their homework, and they did their research on this, and they really realized what we're trying to do, what we're trying to avoid, and a lot of the concerns that I heard from people that seem to be in opposition were really addressed in a very thoughtful, 4 long, well, some of those meetings went to 10:30 at night, so they put a lot of time in this, and this was a unanimous vote. So they got there because a lot of those factors were the testimony that was made, that those were accounted for, accommodated, and adjusted for. And we've been on this for about a year and a half. I've been on this for a year and a half, 2 years, and looked at where has gone wrong in other areas and where it's gone right. And so as a business owner myself and very concerned about neighboring issues and how that impacted my business, I also could, put myself in those shoes. And so I understand that very well. I feel as though we're very, very close to something. And I know that my colleagues have discussed this, and we discussed this together in previous meetings. And so I feel comfortable with a couple things here securing that, and that is the idea, getting back to limiting this to 3. And I like the idea of it being a government operation. Now, mind you, what's not in here, and it can't be in here, and that is the operations agreement. So there's a very site that we're kind of been modeling, or that shaped this in Lane County, Eugene area. And they have a very comprehensive agreement with the operator of the facility that even goes even farther than what we can do in land use to make sure, and that's why this got planning director approval, that a lot of these things they're self-policed. There's a gatekeeper. This is not a camp, but this is very intentional to be, wherever these are sited, to be a transitional facility to get people out of homelessness or houselessness. I've heard since being a commissioner, and I was concerned about this, that this would grow, and I had no idea 7 years ago that this would grow as fast and as problematic as it's been for not only neighbors, but also the people that are homeless themselves. So with that in mind, I think it's important to realize that when city councilors, mayors, people, communities, businesses have reached out saying, you need to do something with this. We have people that are camping on our doorstep. This is a step. This is part of the solution. The solution is, and our strategy here is to get these people out of homelessness and into permanent housing, into a job so they can help themselves. So wherever the area may be, and you're right, Jennifer, you said early on, we need to separate, any proposed sites from what we're doing here today. This is simply the land use action, so we need to think more universally. This is not focused on any particular area, this other than industrial zoning at this point in time, that we need to be cognizant. But I'm very, very confident that we can get between what we're doing here today and this operations agreement that will run these things with the facility in a way that this government ran, that we can address all those concerns out there that we've heard and heard very clearly. I'm sure we'll hear even more today. So that's just my comments for today. And I'm hoping that some of the folks out there that might be concerned about this have read the packet and read all this information, because if you read all that, I think you'll see where a lot of those concerns have been addressed and that there's a strategy in place to address those concerns. So I'm anxious to hear what people have to say today.
Great, we'll move on to the public comment period and ask, are there any public officials in the audience? Seeing none, are there any representatives from CPOs or agencies? Seeing none, I'll now hear testimony from members of the public. And I'm going to call 2 up at a time. So Paul Edgar, Jean Zahari, and Paul, please give your name and address.
Good morning, Commissioners. Paul Edgar, Oregon City. I'm coming before you as a board member of Fort Kennedy, a active, probably the singular entity in Clackamas County that's had a long-term understanding of trying to create housing, tiny type housing, and solutions like this, as well as the outreach entities of trying to create some outreach to the homeless community. Why I'm here has always been one issue: to save lives. It's just simply. We need more than just Band-Aids, and this is part of this continuation of what it is. And what I've been part of other organizations, and am still part of other organizations in attempting to provide outreach, but my focus has been on veterans. It's been the key issue, and this is part of what is being first experimented on with the 115th location off of Jennifer. And part of that, there's this need, and there's a document that was prepared by the federal government, and it's called Achieving the Goals of Ending Veteran Homelessness, the criteria and benchmarks. It was a version that's version 3 dated 10/1/2015. And when I read into this benchmark of what we're trying to do, at least for addressing or providing something to end homelessness for veterans, what we get into it is a need for more than just 200 square foot dwelling units without toilets and any services in it. And small units, we have a lot of veterans that have PTSD. They may have mental illness problems, and quite a few of them that have been chronically homeless have addictions, and they're out there. And so if we're trying to move them into a pod, much like a prisoner of war cell, the problems there are significant. We don't want to see that type of conditions or pressure being placed onto a veteran who served our country and yes, came home with some baggage. But the critical thing here is that when I get into this document of what we have here, it asks for a lot more than what is being in this proposed legislation. A lot more. And we can't achieve what the federal government wants us to achieve within the document and its parameters. I would love to see a continuation of this hearing. And I formally would love to ask for that, so that I can see that there's a lot of people here with a lot of advice and opinions and desire and passion, so that we do something smart. But I don't want to see something embarrass this county, cause us to take a step back from doing something critically needed. And I think that this is an excellent starting point, but it needs more discussion so that what we do, we win. To lose more lives where we have these veterans committing suicide every hour.
You need to finish up.
Thank you. All I can say is I care. I just think we need to be able to do better.
Great, thank you. Gene.
Good morning, Commissioners. I'm Gene Zahari. I'm a resident of Milwaukee, Oregon at 5273 Southeast Jackson Street. And I've been working with a number of people through the MACG organization that some of you, if not all, are aware of, the Metropolitan Alliance for the Common Good, along with a group in conjunction with a Clackamas housing team made up of representatives and pastors from different Clackamas County churches. We have been involved in exploring the options for tiny houses and have run up against the same kind of obstacles you have with ordinance prohibitions and not in my backyard syndromes and all the rest. But I just want to let you know that the onus and the burden is on you now to implement the plan that has come up from zoning, because 2004, HB 2004 had some promise to give local cities, counties, the autonomy to define their own reality. But that was grabbed out from underneath you. So you're going to have to come up with a little better plan, one that may provide services not just or housing for veterans, but for the larger and more vulnerable population, particularly women with children. Thank you for listening, and best of wishes.
Thank you. Next up, Brian Boyce and Robert Rayson.
So, Chair, while those folks are coming up, two things I want the audience to know that, Mr. Edgar pointed out, I guess basically that we need to do more. Granted, we are, but by law, we are confined to the subject matter here today, which is simply the land use action, and our housing projects plural that we're working on, our employment things, all the things that we're doing, health and human services, our veterans affairs, all the things, all other parts of the solution of this very complex problem are being addressed. But today, why we are forced to just be focused on this land use action today, which is really the amendment. So all those concerns we heard are being addressed in other ways, but that's not the place, or today's not the place or the time for that. But that dialogue is something we certainly invite.
Brian?
Okay. I'm Brian Boyce. I live at 13285 South Clackamas River Drive in the northernmost house in Oregon City. I'm a member of the Metropolitan Alliance for Common Good and Independence for Progressive Action, both of which are concerned with housing issues. The MACG group has carried out projects in the past on housing issues and wishes to continue with that in the future. I wanted to say on the question of time limits is that it also requires a community building with all the facilities that normally are within a house, but for the whole community. And if an approved group gets to continue, then those costs will be covered over time. But without that automatic extension, they will be too expensive for a 6-month or 2-year project. And I'll also point out that the what is actually allowed under this with the 200 square foot maximum is inadequate for families. And there'll be very little, fitting in a teenager, let's say, or 2 teenagers with parents is going to be difficult in 200 square feet. And it's going to be primarily for individuals, maybe couples. So some of those issues that were discussed earlier are actually affected by that quite a bit. So I wanted to read a couple of quotes and then get out of your hair here. But the code actually states, or at least in the last copy I read, is that the county new code should meet the needs of the county houseless population through a variety of short and long-term options. And it goes further to say, develop and support a full spectrum of housing, shelter and housing options that assist individuals in moving from houselessness to stable long-term housing solutions. But this particular set of rules is very limited. The majority of homeless people are in families and involve children. And we need a different set of rules so that we can address those issues. And that's what we're looking for in the long term here. And I realize the county has some programs. You have some excellent staff members. And I can speak for other organizations as well as the ones I'm involved in, saying that we need to move forward with more than what this asks for. I do support this. I think it could be a good example for other communities and counties in the area. And we should move forward with it. But it's a limited thing at this point in time. But with more support from the county and more code proposals in the future, both cottage and tiny houses, which are the most cost-effective way of dealing with these issues, they could move forward, because that's what's preventing us from doing those things now.
Great, thank you. And let's try and keep it to 3 minutes because we have a few people out here. All right, go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Robert Rayson, 15988 Southeast Keller Road, Damascus, Oregon. And I'm opposed to this zoning change proposition. And as a history, I spent 5 years looking for industrial land several years back. I searched the entire county, and it was a long, arduous process to find properly zoned industrial property. I have a welding shop, and it took a long time to find this land. And this is the premier land, industrial land in Clackamas County. According to your website, there's 1,880 square miles of land in Clackamas County. And I could not find how many square miles of industrial land there is, but it has to be, I'm guessing, the smallest portion of your zoned property within the county. And we are the people who create the jobs. We're not just adding another Starbucks. We're not a bunch of baristas. We actually make stuff. This is the concrete plants. We're the welders. We produce stuff. We ship it out. And I know that there's great intention here. I don't have any question about that whatsoever. But to eat up industrial land with housing issues, I think is poorly thought out. Now, I went to the Planning Commission, and I know staff works on this. I'm not sure about the whole process. I don't know how this works. If you guys tell staff, make this work, and then convince the planners, because I was there with the planners, and they were making up conditions on the spot to try to sway the divided planning that was going on there. I think there's a lot of better ideas, frankly, in this 1,880 square miles of land than to have homeless, houseless people injected into an industrial site. Now, there's people here, now you say we can't talk about 115th. That was on all of the stuff that was sent out to us, and it's a perfect example. So we're not going to talk about it, but as an example, it's a terrible idea to put veterans, like the other gentleman mentioned, with PTSD right next to a concrete plant that is zoned to make unlimited noise 24 hours a day. They have dump trucks that can bang their tailgates all night long. They vibrate. They make concrete. I just think it should have a little more thought for your good intentions that could be far superior to, and as I understand this project, that they have to close this thing so that they just sleep there. So you're going to interject these people with no transportation, no sidewalks, and I don't know if they're on wheelchairs, crutches, how do they get around? And they have to leave, and they're in the middle of an industrial area. Then it's going to be with kids right around heavy, this is heavy industrial. Maybe you get my point.
Okay, so Commissioner Schrader had a question?
Do you mind if I ask you a question?
Sure. Your mic's not on.
So what's the nature of your business and how many acres were you looking for? I'm just
I
kind of
bought
curious.
2 acres on Capps Road. I'm within a quarter of a mile of the 115th site.
And what kind of business? You've got an industrial?
It's just, it's I-3, you know, I have a building, I have my welding shop, and then I rent out
Okay,
space
welding.
to other people. Mhm.
Okay.
Heavy industrial, I-3.
Yeah. And you had difficulty finding,
I did,
Yeah.
yeah. I spent 5 years looking for it, yes.
did you ever contact our economic development team to help you locate at all?
Well, I built my building 10 years ago. It was, right now it's about 20 years ago.
Okay.
But am I incorrect that industrial land is one of the smallest portions of your zoning in this 1,880 square miles?
I can't really speak to that off the top of my head. I do know that we have, if you located 20 years ago, I wasn't here, but today we actually have, just for your information for other businesses out there, we have an economic development team that actually works directly with businesses to help them find the land and the inventory that we have. So since you had that issue, we now have if you can check our website, you can check to see the larger inventory of what we have. And we have economic development professionals that actively work directly with the businesses to locate. The issue with this piece of property that we were talking about, it's kind of a small orphan piece way in the back by a creek. And I think it's been for sale for how long? I don't know. I think that's something our development people would know.
Well, I've never seen a sign for that, and I
there's
know
one.
there's people looking for land all the time. Maybe if it was advertised a little bit better, but I would like to mention, I used to have the piece of land across from what was the old gravel pit, 120th in Capps, and I had to sell that because the regulations that were required of me, the sidewalks, water retention, paving, lighting, and all that stuff, made it economically unviable for me to develop that. I just didn't have the resources because of all of the issues, and now projects like this, it's being, design review is being waived. I think it's bizarre.
Well, thank you for coming, and I just wanted to
right.
get a sense of what the
Thank
business
you.
was.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
So next up is Tom Gustafson and Mike Fields. Thank you for coming. Name and where you live.
I'll go. My name is Mike Fields, and I represent the property at 11340 Southeast Jennifer. And we are the ready mix company that Mark was referring to. And the issues we have with the zoning change is we do run 24/7. Potentially, we're customer driven. When customers need concrete, we deliver it. We get deliveries through the evening, all night long, in dump trucks and semi-trucks, bulk deliveries. It's loud. When we're making concrete, we do run vibrators on the plant. We have concerns over that, just changing the zoning so that we have difficulty running. And that's really about all I wanted.
All right, thank you. Any questions? Go ahead, Tom.
Hello, I'm Tom Gustafson, a property owner at 12301 Southeast Carpenter Road, which is currently leased to Disdale Lumber Company. I, as well as Robert, earlier expressed would have problems with limiting the use of industrial and light industrial land. I think it's a poor choice for the county to further limit what is a commodity and scarce supply. I think in the document I have here, the notice, the word village is used, and I think it's kind of incongruous to put a pod of 30 homes, small homes, in an industrial area and have any notion of a village. The services required for people, particularly veterans, if that's who this is being targeted to, a lot of medical services, a lot of social services, a lot of men and women with some psychological issues. You know, the Jennifer site, just as an example, is 1.7 miles away from Fred Meyer's. I don't think anybody in this room walked 1.7 miles to pick our own groceries up, to pick our own Kleenex up, to pick our own shirts up. If you try and put this type of residential facility in an industrial area, I think the incongruity of that is alarming. The safety issues, to think about putting a pod of 30 people, or 30 pods, which is probably 40, 50 people living there, in areas without sidewalks, in areas with hundreds of trucks running through there. You're going to have conflicts with bicycles. As we know in the Portland metro area, lots of homeless folks have bicycles. That's how they get around. You're going to put bikes on a road with no sidewalks, with trucks going 40 miles an hour, hundreds of these trucks. I think it's a little bit of oil and water with this zoning change. Although I think clearly our metro area and Clackamas County has an issue that needs to be dealt with for homelessness, and certainly with veterans. We have obligations that go beyond that. I think those are important goals, but I think the mix and how it's proposed right now is ill-suited. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So next up is Ed Gronke and Mark Wright. Thank you for coming. Good to see you again, Ed. Go ahead.
Well, I guess I'm first. Well, good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the commission. My name is Ed Gronke. I live at 4912 Southeast Rynerson Road in Jennings Lodge. I have to admit, I am guilty of not really paying a great deal of attention to this issue until the last 2 or 3 months. As many of you know, I've spent the last 9 years of my life deeply involved in another area, in planning the area. But I've come to accept this, to realize that this is something really important. I offer you my sympathy because I'm quite sure no matter how you decide this morning, you will succeed in making a sizable portion of your voters extremely unhappy. And I understand that. I sympathize with you. I hope that you keep in mind that your responsibility as an elected official is more than just satisfying a lot of the voters out there, but you have a responsibility to the greater good of the entire community. And I think you have to keep this in mind. It strikes me as a somewhat outsider, and I did spend the last 24 hours carefully reading all 123 pages of this document, all the comments. This is as much of a political as it is a humanitarian decision. I'm troubled by the location in light industry and general industry zones. It strikes me in reading the description as laid out, it just brings back notes in my mind, memories of the internment camps because of the way it's fenced off, separated from everyone, sort of out of sight, out of mind. I'm sure you did not intend that, but that's the way it comes across. And I'm wondering why you don't look at other areas such as C3 along McLaughlin, general business areas that might be much more suitable for this because of their easy access to transportation and facilities that these people are going to need. I think we have to remember that what we're dealing with here are individuals. They're people like us. They're not just commodities to be pushed off into an area to be forgotten about. I think this serves a very small portion of the population the way you have it designed, and part of this was the recommendations of the Planning Commission, and I can understand the reasons for that. But I know it's also a very small part of a much greater policy that you're developing. I commend you for that. I am wondering, have you spoken to any of the potential users of this facility? They might have some very interesting opinions to offer you. Thank you.
Okay, Paul?
Yeah, just real quickly, many visits to other sites and talking to the residents within those. And again, these are designed to be transition shelters that we talked to specifically, that I spoke to. And yes, relief. And for those in the audience and others, you know, they have to, one operation in particular that we're trying to model after, they have to produce a transition plan to get themselves up and out into a job and housing. So the only pressure that I sensed from talking to them was the pressure from their community to have a transition plan out into bigger and better things. So it's they were happy to be, you know, where they were, as opposed to where there as opposed to where they were out on the street, or you know, under a tree or wherever that may be, or on a sidewalk or in a dangerous area. But it's where they were going. And again, transition is the theme here, and it's not a permanent camp of any sort. So I think in that context, I think they were relieved.
Well, I think what struck me, the comments from the business users in general, if I had to sum them up, all came down to the same thing. It's a basic incompatibility. And they are where they are because of the nature of what they do. And I'm not sure it's fair to the houseless people to put them in that same area.
Okay. Thank you. Mark?
Yeah, I'm Mark Wright, owner of Health Right Products right there on Capps Road. I've worked with your economics development group heavily. I've worked with a lot of you guys over the years as well. Employ a lot of people in that local area, and I'm going to repeat a lot of things you've already heard. Very, very concerned. We had a lot of work that we had to do to be able to get light industrial and general industrial land. It's one of the least available lands you have in the county. Because of that, it also creates some of the most highest cost for that land. In order to buy that land, because it is in scarce supply, we have to pay a premium for it. And then we had to spend a lot of money putting in our water systems, our water retention ponds, our infiltration ponds to comply with all the rules and regulations that that land use required us to do. All that was money we spent to invest in this county to generate jobs and to generate above average wage jobs, to create more ability for people to better themselves, to have health care, and to continue to do that. And we're continuing to work with your economics development group to try to grow our business and become a stronger employer in the community. Very concerned about the same things that most people have already said, so you've heard it already. I think, you know, we talk about this being a general zoning change and the 115th being not the issue. Whether it be 115th or any other light industrial area, you have the same problems. You have the same issues with lack of public transportation. You have no sidewalks. You have lacks of lighting. You are putting them kind of in a corner. Certainly agree with the comment of putting them into a C3 area where they have access to services, food, and other things of that nature. Very concerned about the safety of our employees, theft issues. I don't know what your answer is. I don't know what the right solution is. I don't pretend to. And I do sympathize with your guys' plight because it is an issue we need to resolve, especially for our veterans. Absolutely have a heart for that. But I'm very concerned about putting them inside of an industrial area that we have a very limited amount of land for, and that we're trying to generate more revenue, more tax revenue for the county, more jobs for the county. And that's my biggest concern. The other thing I would ask the question of, and I don't know that you have the answers to it today, but we talk about it being transitional. I'm curious as to what the timeline on that is. How long is transitional? I'm curious as to how you measure success. This is meant to be a pilot program. How will you measure if it works or doesn't work? What's the timeline for that measurement? What are the metrics you'll use? How many dollars from the county are going to be tagged to this project? And for how long? So how do we burden, is it going to burden the other resources? Are our police departments going to be burdened? Are our fire and medical departments going to be burdened? And what's the cost of that? Now, these are all things you may have already considered and have answers to, and I'm just not aware of. But those are the things that definitely raise concerns in my mind. Appreciate it. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Next up, Laura Gentry and Mark Childs. So name and where you live.
Sure. Hi, I'm Laura Gentry, and I live in Tigard, Oregon, but I represent a property owner who has about 40 acres on Jennifer Street. I'm with KG Investment Properties. We're a third-party management company. I guess the first thing I would say is I think this is a really noble cause, and I understand housing is a huge problem in the city of Portland, probably one of the worst in the country, and I applaud your efforts. I personally think this idea is a great idea. I've done quite a bit of research on the Opportunity Village facility in Eugene that you're modeling this after, and I think it's got a lot of really strong merits. My concern with it is that the facility in Eugene, I believe, is in a mixed-use zone. I'm not positive about that, but it's definitely surrounded by single-family homes, some light industrial, some office buildings. It's a mile and a half from the Fifth Street Public Market. It's probably a mile from the Holt Center in downtown Eugene. There's a mobile home park half a block away. It's definitely a mixed-use environment. I have huge concerns about putting this sort of a facility, especially for veterans, as you've heard from others, who have maybe PSTD or noise issues or a challenge, to put this sort of a facility in a general industrial zone. And the area that we're specifically talking about with the project that is on everybody's mind on 115th is the noise in industrial zones and the traffic and the 53-foot trucks and the lack of sidewalks and lack of transportation, et cetera, et cetera. We actually just finished development in April of last year on a 190,000 square foot facility, a block from the 115th site. There are sidewalks the length of 1,080 feet, which is the frontage of our site, and a bike path because we dedicated 10 feet to the county in order to have those facilities put in. But that sidewalk and those bike paths are only the length of that property, and then they terminate on either side of that. So there is very, very limited public and pedestrian space near this specific site. So I think that site really needs to be strongly reconsidered. But from the 50,000-foot level and the zoning change, industrial sites typically are noisy. They have hazardous materials issues. They are heavy trucking. They're not sites that people typically want to live next door to. And so I think that looking at the general industrial zone is a tough one. I really think that this should be considered for other zoning situations, whether it's mixed use or residential or retail or whatever it is. I just think that it's the wrong zone to be focusing on. The other issue I would bring up is air quality in industrial zones because of the type of work that's being done. The air quality, I think, can be compromised. Okay.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, my name is Mark Childs. I handle industrial real estate brokerage for Capacity Commercial at 805 Southwest Broadway, Portland. I'm here to speak on behalf of both myself and my associate, Alan Patterson. Folks have said earlier that you can define your own reality, which I don't believe you can, and that there's plenty of property out there that's zoned industrial and there isn't, and this property hasn't been on the market, or I would have had someone in it a long time ago. Together, Alan and I have over 164 acres of land listed in Clackamas County, and together we sold 17 parcels totaling 63 acres in the greater Portland area last year alone. With over 66 years of experience in the Clackamas County industrial real estate market, we believe this proposal would be a disaster for Clackamas County. Some life in what I call in the gutter, which is out there hustling for real estate people. Industrial zoning has matured to its current status for a reason. Industrial users need to know with certainty who their neighbors are going to be and what they will or won't be allowed to do. It is not unlike residential development, but through the zoning, it's like a set of CC&Rs, except on steroids. Industrial users need to have heavy truck traffic pass safely, both for the trucks and the neighbors, operate in a secure environment, and know that their noise and or odor will not be found to be offensive to their neighbors. This is all accomplished through industrial zoning. Industrial users are often betting tens of millions of dollars that their investment will support their operation and enhance their image with both their customers and suppliers. They cannot afford the risk of the county arbitrarily deciding to drop a residential use into their neighborhood. They need certainty in their investment, both today and into the future. This ordinance will not provide this level of certainty, and we know from our experience that our customers would and will elect to locate elsewhere. I have a heart. I grew up in the Marshall-Lentz School District. I'm president of a nonprofit that provides food that feeds the working poor and 60 other agencies, including Food for Clackamas County Food Bank. We touch over 10,000 people per week. I understand helping and doing good, but locating any residential use in an industrial area will do no one any good. On average, I relocate roughly 50,000 square foot manufacturing company with around 40 employees almost annually. I'm working on 2 of those now. I don't recommend Multnomah County. I'm a 5th generation that grew up in it. I have recommended Clackamas County and have worked closely with Cindy on many of those. You're looking at probably a $500 million loss in value to these industrial folks from this hit, and that's jobs losses. You have in your records to go to Audi Road on, I'm done?
You're over.
I'm good.
Finish up.
Well, there's a spot on Audi Road just west of I-5 It's kind of in a hole, let's face it, between the freeway and the retail on 82nd. You folks have identified it as a place for low income. You need to look at another location outside of industrial zoning. Thank you for the extra time.
Thank you. Next up, Kelly Ross and Gary McAdams, I believe that's what it says.
I just want to make a comment, Chair, that one of the speakers, Ms. Gentry, mentioned the site in Eugene, and I know it very well. I have two family members who live on the other side of the industrial area, across the railroad tracks in the residential area. And actually, one of the businesses in this industrial area where this Opportunity Village is, I used to trade with when I had my business in Eugene. So I know the area very well. It's not residential. It's not commercial or office. And in actuality, yeah, it's a very small town, so a mile here or a mile there, there are certainly other facilities, businesses, and so forth. But in that area, it's industrial. There's a lot of heavy truck traffic. But actually, it's been found to be, the way it's ran because of this operations agreement, very compatible. And it's been really embraced by the community, the city, the county commissioners, and the local neighbors. And they have, again, embraced this in this model because it has been controlled and it hasn't been posed any detriment to the neighboring businesses. And that's what we're trying to model it after. And so, again, not everything in there in the agreement is something we can place in this ordinance. So I just wanted to respond. That's all I have.
Okay, Kelly?
Good morning. Mr. Chair, Commissioners, my name is Kelly Ross, and I'm appearing before you this morning on behalf of three commercial and industrial real estate organizations in the metro area, the Commercial Association of Brokers of Oregon and Southwest Washington, the Society of Industrial and Office Realtors, and NAOP, the Commercial Real Estate Development Association. We submitted a three-page letter to you, and I'm not going to go over that again. I want to reiterate some of the points that Mr. Childs and Ms. Gentry just raised, and kind of segue from that into talking about economic development, since Commissioner Schrader brought up the county's efforts in that regards, and just to reinforce the fact that adoption of this ordinance will send up a huge red flag to any potential investors or companies thinking of coming into Clackamas County, that any due diligence report will tell potential investors and companies that there's the possibility of a transitional shelter community being located next to them. So our first preference would be for this proposal to be abandoned, but we did have a very good discussion earlier this week with Commissioner Savas, and he talked about what the ultimate goal of this effort is, and like others, I applaud your efforts for thinking outside the box in this huge problem. So my advice to you would be, if the board is inclined to go forward on this, is to pursue some of the suggestions of the Planning Commission, but go even further to narrow the scope of this ordinance as narrowly as possible. And that would be requiring that siting be done on a publicly owned piece of property, and that it be operated by a government agency. You may want to make a sunset date even sooner and decrease the number of projects that was proposed by the Planning Commission for sunset. You may want to, and I would urge you to decrease the area, the geographic area where this type of a project could be built, rather than using the entire light industrial and general industrial zones, to narrow it as narrowly as possible to reduce the number of sites that could be available for that. Let me end by saying it was very interesting listening in a little bit on your previous
land use hearing and hearing what everyone's comments about high-value farmland, I would urge you to take the same perspective towards high-value industrial land, that it is just as an important asset for this region and the state as high-value farmland. Thank you.
Thank you. Gary?
Mr. Bernard and associates, as we all know each other because we've been working on this project for the last 2 years. First thing I want to say, as the president of Vietnam Veterans of America for the Portland metropolitan area and the president of All Military Veterans Outreach Organization, which consists of 13 nonprofits under one roof with 10,000 square feet of space. Oh, by the way, it's in the middle of an industrial area, and it's working fine, and it has worked fine for the last 2 years. I wouldn't want your job for all the money in the world. Do I care where it's at? I don't care. Do we need it? Absolutely. Because the freedom of the people that are behind me that are balking about this use or that use or this use or that use, they wouldn't have the use if it wasn't for the veterans that have been on the ground since 1973 and to present. They wouldn't have the businesses unless these people had went and fought for their freedom. Now, in regards to kids, I don't see in the beginning, in the first phase, I don't see kids being involved. There's other portions. The one point I want to make in closing is this. We don't need it run by a bureaucracy. We need it run by veterans. A conglomerate of veterans, because veterans speak veterans. Now, earlier, Paul spoke about we're just wanting to save one life. Well, folks, last year we saved 9 confirmed lives saved in Clackamas County. We fed over 156 people 5 family meals at Thanksgiving and Christmas. We have a center that's open today as we speak. We're not supposed to be open, but because of the heat, we've opened a cooling shelter. So if you want to see what veterans can do for veterans without it costing our government, our county, any money, come see. Ask these commissioners what they've seen. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, Kirk Olson and John Stransky. Thank you for coming today.
Hello, my name is John Stransky. I'm representing Warren Industries at 12900 Southeast Capps Road. I support the intent of what you're trying to do and what the commission's trying to do. But it seems like doing so in a zoned area that is for industrial is just the wrong spot to be doing it. It feels like the one location that we've discussed over and over it feels like it's from convenience, that piece of property is available and that would be a good place to get started. But it doesn't feel like it's the best opportunity for the people who would be going there. And it doesn't feel like it's the best opportunity for those of us who have some concerns about individuals living temporarily in this industrially zoned area for the many reasons that have been mentioned today. Some of the things that have been brought up prior to discussion having to do with whether there would be an operator that has to prove the ability to run it and not yet understanding if there's a method for determining what that would be, that's concerning without a plan to evaluate operators. Not knowing yet whether it's going to be run by the government or run individually by a charitable organization, I think that should be understood. An item that's been mentioned and in an industrial area where there's not transportation, That seems like a big problem for the people that would try to be served in this regard, that there's just not any public transportation to get to this location. And so with a number of items still to be determined, I find it difficult to move forward with this until further discussion takes place to try and get to those items. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Go ahead.
My name is Kirk Olson, and I'm here with a number of hats on, I think. I am here as a resident of Clackamas County and a person who has experience with family members being homeless. My family, and including my 3 young kids, we spend our Sundays regularly feeding homeless people in Portland, and my father's a vet, so I'm sympathetic to those in need, and I'm very appreciative as a resident of the county of your efforts to address this issue, which is a crisis issue. It is an emergency issue, and it's one that needs to be addressed quickly. So thank you for that. My other hat, my other capacity is of a professional real estate developer. And, you know, our region is known throughout the world for its land use planning. It really is. The communities and counties and cities, metro included, grapple a lot with compatible land use planning issues. And, you know, I am just curious, I don't know the history of your efforts. I think it's been a while now. Someone mentioned a couple of years at this. But my curiosity really is just about choosing industrial to modify the comp plan to accommodate this. And my curiosity is just all the other zones. I briefly counted, there are 50 land use zones in Clackamas County. 7 of which include the word village, like village community service. And I'm just curious how much effort was put to analyzing other zones for this particular use. And to me, it just seems, we've heard about the incompatibility question before, it just seems like this would be the most severe incompatible uses, and I just wonder if there are other zones more appropriate, notwithstanding the work that you've all done that I'm unclear of. Finally, and third, is my capacity as a representative of Trammell Crow Company, who has an interest in industrial land. We are under contract to purchase 16 acres on Capps Road from the county. We're very appreciative to be in this position and are looking forward to making a very significant investment. The land that we've identified and have been involved with for the last 7 years is earmarked for jobs. There are metrics that you all have put on this 50-acre piece just south of Capps Road that include job density, job quality by way of wage measurement, and the type of development that you want to see there. So we are excited to conduct our due diligence and feasibility on the site and to invest what our pro forma is showing is over $25 million in order to attract and retain businesses, the type of jobs that provide working family wages. And my concern there is what will our investors think, what will potential users and companies locating to the park that we intend to build think, and I just have a general concern about some of the unknowns with respect to the proposal now as received by investors and users for the park.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you. I don't have anybody else signed up, so we're gonna close the public portion. I want to start off with a couple comments and then we'll go to you. So first off, out of sight, out of mind, I totally agree. It's a shame that we have to go this way, it seems that the homeless people, we don't want to see them. It's not dissimilar to people who go to prison. We hope they go there and we never see them again. But in reality, they do come back and we will see them. And it is sad that we have to do this, but I do agree that we should, I would like to limit this to county-owned property, but also add churches, because I know there are a lot of churches out there that are looking at doing similar projects. And no one would come up here and say they don't support the intent. I'd be surprised if anyone came up. But that site is for 10 years. I've been here, I'm on my 9th year. That CAPS site, we've been trying to sell it for 9 years. No one's ever come up. And usually when they do, what they want is us to give it to them, to build everything for them. And, one of the proposals, I thought we might have to write them a check to take it. So, I mean, it's not like this site has been a huge draw. Right now it is, finally. Now, of course, in the last 9 years, we've had a very down economy. So, people who complain that, well, we thought all this growth was going to occur, well, it stopped everywhere. So you could take 5 years out of there and feel comfortable. But this site's been for sale for a long time with very little or no interest. And hopefully the businesses in the next project will maybe look across the street and hire the vets. If you hire the vets, they'll be gone, and then we'll open that up for another opportunity. So there's a great opportunity to hire the vets. Recently, I went to a project, Kenton neighborhood, and I was pretty much totally against this kind of project until I talked to those people. So a homeless person spends most of their day watching their stuff, moving around, worried about whether they're safe. So in the Kenton neighborhood, they have a home. By the way, a lot of traffic. Terrible, dusty little place. This place is a big improvement. But the first thing they said is that they realized they had more time because they didn't have to watch their stuff. They had a place to put it and secure it. And they were able to take a shower and go look for a job. I think that was really important because they're not spending their entire day doing that. And, I would prefer that this be limited to this site rather than all industrial sites. But if we add in the government-owned, I think that makes a big difference. And then churches, because I think they have, there's a lot of opportunity. I know I went to one of the meetings in Milwaukee, and the mayor was there, and churches were interested in the discussion, whether they wanted 1 or 2 units, something of interest. But, the fact also that it's a temporary permit, we'll be looking at this in 2 years. I assume we're going to look at how successful it is in 2 years, and then the amendments to the code will be either continued or eliminated. So I do have concerns about out of sight, out of mind. I do have concerns that it's quite a distance from really good transportation. I know that a few years ago when we tried to do a housing project in Oregon City, the first thing the federal government said is the transit opportunities are terrible. But I'm hoping that whoever does this, which will be managed by H3S, will look to somebody who might be able to provide additional alternative transportation to get to public transportation. But also the thing that I learned about this Kenton neighborhood is that the community really gets together and watches out for one another. They create the rules, they adhere to the rules, or they're out. And I think that's what's important, that you can't just put a bunch of people in there and give them a bunch of rules, because I don't know about you, but I remember when I didn't like to follow the rules. That was like 40, 50 years ago. But anyway, I think heard some great discussion, and I'm interested in hearing from you guys.
Yeah.
Paul?
Well, thank you, Chair. So I want to clarify, we tried early on to try and separate the land use action from a potential site that we're looking at in this area, which is not the Caps Road site. And I think one of the gentlemen said I don't think it is even for sale because it's a challenge site that we have not even gotten ready for sale, as I understand it. So this happens to be in that vicinity, but it is not the Caps Road site and not for sale. And I'm looking for a head nod from Barb on that. Am I correct, Barb? Okay, so anyhow, the comments about industrial versus this zoning or that zoning, I've been listening in, reading articles, gone to other hearings in other jurisdictions, tremendous amount going on in Portland. If you hear their arguments when they're talking about commercial, they say, no, not commercial, it's gonna be horrible for business because we're trying to attract people to come to our place of business and the traffic flow in and out and the storefront, the curb appeal, all those things, all those arguments are made from the commercial side. When you hear it from the residential side, they talk about the safety of their children because maybe they envision that there'll be a safety issue. So for every zone you choose, you'll hear from that. You'll hear the very same arguments that Mr. Ross, for example, made, that it'll perhaps be a deterrent or maybe a devaluation or a lack of investment in those areas. Well, those same arguments are true in almost every zone. And people say, oh, they ought to go here and they ought to go there. Well, where are the homeless today? They're in all those zones. They're in every one of them. Matter of fact, even the site that people are concerned about here today, representing some of those, they're already there. And they're creating, concerns, but this is a means to solving those issues, frankly. I think that wherever that site may be, if this is government operated or it's operated by these folks these communities tend to be for their own self-existence, to be self-sustained. They want to make sure that every one of their members, every one of their residents that are sitting on these transition sites are good actors and are acting behaviorally in a respectful way because they know that their future would be threatened otherwise if they don't act. So it is, like Chair Bernard just kind of stated, in a way, I'll use different words, it's self-policed. And I think that's great. I see that as an opportunity. And this is a very difficult decision for me because since I've been here and even when I was running, prior to even being a commissioner, I was advocating for more employment lands. So partially this is somewhat being conflicted, but we're only talking very small parcels. And there is a shortage of large industrial lots for large base employers. We have somewhat, I won't say in abundance, but a majority of our industrial lands are much smaller. This, for example, or a lot of the sites we'd be looking at would be small in scale. We wouldn't certainly be putting this on any kind of a large site. So I think a lot of those concerns I heard we're going to try to address, and I foresee in the discussion I had with Mr. Ross and some of his colleagues on Monday when I met with them that maybe in short time we're looking at a very similar ordinance in commercial property. I don't know. But that's what I really have at this point. I'm also anxious to hear from my colleagues as well and share at some point maybe even a bit of a short recess as well. Might be in order.
The recess probably isn't going to work. We're either going to have to schedule another one because some of us have other commitments. Oops. Sorry, the mic wasn't on. The recess isn't going to work because some of us have other commitments. So I haven't heard from you guys. I mean, one thing I'd like to entertain is in the motion with the condition that the property be limited to government or church owned. But go ahead.
You go ahead first. I'll wait.
So I'm not ready to get there today. I have too many questions, and a lot of the questions are, what does the authority of H3S have with transitional housing? I know I've done a lot of work at the state level, and sometimes when there are a lot of regulations that are on the books, it's really hard for government to step in and regulate. And we're talking about changing zoning to allow our most vulnerable citizens to be in industrial sites with children in situations that could be very compromised. And we may not have the tools and the ability to go in and regulate. That's a very big concern for me. So I'm not comfortable moving forward without that question being answered. And I am very concerned about people that have post-traumatic stress being in areas where there's lots of noise. I know I don't suffer from post-traumatic stress, but I know when my Commissioner Humberson right next to me clicks his pen and I'm just trying to listen, I just have to glare at him and say, Commissioner, stop it. So I can't even imagine being in a battle zone and having a sensitivity to sound and being in a place where concrete is being made overnight. I have such compassion and such concern. I really want to hear, and I appreciate, Gary, you being here and sharing what you shared. I really want to hear more from our veterans to say, does this work for you? I've heard, just in my conversations with veterans, some mixed things. I don't have a unified, yes, this is what we need right now. This is a big picture change. This is a big picture policy change, and it allows things that I don't know that's where we want to go as a community. I was really sort of inspired, and I can't remember the gentleman's name in the back, but said he's been looking for industrial, and you know, if he could get it, he would buy it, or whatever you said, and use it. It's like, okay, well, what is that property worth, and could we sell it, and could we take the proceeds from that and purchase other space where we could serve people in a better way? I do agree that we need a place. We need a place where we can bring people together so that we can deliver services when they're in that place of transition, when we need to move them from one place to the next. I'm just not there in knowing if this, in industrial sites, is the right answer, so.
So Mary, we would need a date certain. I'm sure that's what you're doing over there. Ken.
Once again, we have a conflict of positive values. Seems like that's the theme of the day. I sit here as a veteran with a nice home and a good family and all of the benefits that one could enjoy in a middle-class lifestyle. But I look out there and I see so many other people, particularly from my generation, but also younger generations, that are not so lucky. Something has to be done, and it cannot wait forever. The reality is that I don't care where we put this type of housing, someone is going to say, no, we don't want it here. And there's lots of arguments that one can make as to why we don't want it here or why we do not want it there. It's got to be somewhere. And we happen to own this piece of land. So to the person who commented about it should be government land or public land, this is a piece that we actually own. The need is now. It's not 3 years from now. And it's probably going to continue for some time to come because we've been at war for 15 years. And it doesn't look like that's going to end. And more people will be coming home, and more people are going to need the help. It's not the perfect solution, but I don't think there is a perfect solution. It's a piece of a long-term solution to a very big problem. It's the first step of getting people off the street and into some kind of shelter where they can then get help and where they can move to the next step, to more permanent housing. And we are looking at all of those steps. But this is the first and most immediate step, and it needs to be taken. And this is the only place and opportunity we have at this moment in time to deal with the problem. The particular issue that's before us today, of course, is just the changing of the zoning. But the reality is everybody sitting in this room knows that once that zoning is changed, a decision will be made as to location, and one of the locations is an industrial area. We are not sitting here reinventing the wheel. It has been done in another and actually several other locations successfully. So we will be, whatever we choose to do, we will be modeling after successful programs. So I'll defer to my colleagues as to whether we move forward immediately today or not. I understand it's important that everybody's comfortable before we move forward, but I personally am prepared to move forward. I agree with the idea that it should be government-owned or publicly owned, and we want to be certain that H3S has systems in place to assure that the model that we hope to have is functional. And I'll leave my comments there. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You have some, Martha?
Yeah, I waited to last with intent because I wanted to give for the public the genesis of this. I was really meeting with Commissioner Pat Farr down in Lane County, and I want to thank the person that testified that she'd done the research on Opportunity Village, because that was a result of visiting it and looking at some of the other kinds of possibilities that are there. So what we did, and I think part of the issue with our business community and other folks, we haven't informed you about what the process has been here to date, and I will take ownership of that. Basically, what we did internally is we pulled together for the first time that I can recall in the history of the county an interdisciplinary team, which included folks from Housing and Human Services, including code enforcement, including planning, including our development agency, including our economic development and workforce folks, including the folks that even work with our park system. And what we did was have a discussion about what it would take to look at the model that has got support from the business community down in Eugene. You know, how could we implement something here as a start with our veterans? So it really is, I think people, I know we're getting caught on site specific. What it really is a pilot project to see how it works. And working with our staff and watching them problem solve internally was probably one of the most remarkable things I'd ever seen, because I saw people who were from the business development agency side communicating directly with folks from our human services side, and they had never really connected in that way before, and planning getting involved, saying, well, in order to do something like this, you have to look at the planning, you have to look at the zoning, you have to look at what that would take to make this happen from a land use perspective. So the reason why this particular site popped up, but let's not get too site specific. The reason it popped up was because we own it. It's way in the back. It's wooded. It's got grass. It's got an opportunity. It's a kind of a pleasant area. And the key thing was it was government owned. That was a piece of it. Now, it's not the only possibility out there. This was a first step for us to grapple with what it would take to transform our land use policies so it would make it possible for us to think outside of the box. And I know that that's part of the uncertainty that I'm hearing from people, because it makes people nervous, it makes them uncomfortable. You worry about what the impacts are going to be, how they're going to be mitigated. I get all of that. But what I wanted to really emphasize is that there's no good place to put houseless people, really. We're just trying to take an initial step forward with a very big, huge problem, with a very focused demographic that has served this country, because we believe that what they did for us is so important. And this is just a step forward trying to grapple with what that would take from an interdisciplinary way to make that happen. It doesn't necessarily have to be sited there. We're just looking for some flexibility to see where we can site, what would be possible, and what would work. It could be a huge success. It could be just a crazy failure. I don't know. All I know is, at this point, from my perspective, anything's going to be better than being under the bridge and camping and whatever. That's kind of what, that's the state we're in. It's so disheartening. It's so tiring to think that this is the best we can do, but it's a step forward, and that's what I want people to understand today. We're not trying to hurt business. We're not trying to do anything untoward. We're trying to grapple with this to find some way of helping and solving it. And I think everybody in this audience gets that, knows that, and has the heart for that. Any project of this kind will provide some safe shelter, a chance to build skills through service, gain dignity, sense of self-worth through self-governance, community. We've had health, housing, and transportation experts review the health and safety issues. Okay, we've done all of that groundwork. I just don't think we've communicated it well enough to the folks who are highly concerned about it yet. So I really would prefer not to hold it over, but I am inclined to work with Commissioner Fisher to kind of get the answers to these questions. But in order to do so, I've got to be honest with you. The folks that came up here today from Warren and from NAIOP and from all those areas, we and folks I know here who are housing advocates, if you're not at the table with us, we can't solve it. And it doesn't do anybody any good when we're trying to grapple with this, move forward with the tremendous work the staff has done to figure this out. I don't want to move forward if you folks aren't on board with it, but I need you here. We need to have a committee. We need to have people who are in the business community at the table with us in order to move this forward. I don't see any way out of it otherwise, and the veterans community. So I don't want to throw this project down the tubes, I'll be honest with you. We worked too long and too hard, and we had staff for hours just working so well. I don't want to throw that away. But I would be willing, as someone who's been doing this job for a long time, to take some more time with all of you. But that would mean that you have to make a commitment to this commission to help us. Okay? The people that showed up here today, I'm going to challenge you to come to this county at this table and help grapple with this problem directly, so you have ownership, so you won't have uncertainty, you won't have fear, you won't feel as if we're somehow imposing something from the top down that's going to hurt your ability to get jobs to people and do jobs for people. So I feel very passionate about this. I've been a veterans advocate for many years. I worry because we're approaching another winter, and if we continue to put this off, we may not have anything for anybody. I will pledge to you personally that I will look at other possibilities and sites as well, but please don't have it be site specific. But all of you came up here today, you have signed up. We've got your name, we've got your address, and we've got your phone number now. And I'm serious, I know, we do. So I'm done. I'm tired. I would suggest with Commissioner Fisher that we put this over to a date certain. I hope it doesn't interfere with my daughter's wedding, but I'll call in if I have to. And get some of these questions answered, but that means I'm truly expecting, Kelly, I'm expecting you to come. Our gentleman from Warren Industries, I need you here. The lovely woman who talked about it, and I know your dad was a veteran, we talked about it. I need you here, and we need to do it fast. And any advocates that want to come and listen and sit at the table with us, that's what I suggest we do. And really, thank you. I see Rich Swift. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank all of you, because you guys, they did phenomenal work. To see an interdisciplinary team break down silos in this county was absolutely amazing.
Okay, Sonia needs to go, so we need
All
to
right, go.
move
I'm
on.
done.
Don't go yet.
Sorry, don't make me cry. Okay.
So I think we're confusing a site with what we're doing here today. We really are, and I really intently listened to both Commissioner Fisher and Commissioner Schrader, and I think that what you want to address are more site-specific businesses near that site, and that's not what we're doing today. That's a whole different process, and I think that will follow this. And if it's not these particular businesses, if we find another site, we'll be up against the same thing. So I think it's imperative to, again, focus what we're doing here today, which is just the land use piece, has nothing to do with this site. I thank Commissioner Humberston for stating what he is, so I'm not going to address Commissioner Humberston in this. I'm going to address my other three colleagues. The urgency, the things that many people spoke here today, and also articulated by Commissioner Humberston, are very well spoken, and there is no right solution. I am an advocate for businesses, and I got involved in this because I thought I saw 7 or 8 years ago a path, not to prosperity, but a path to poverty. It is much worse than I thought. I never envisioned, people who knew me never envisioned I would be here today advocating for this, but I think it's imperative to move forward today on this piece, and there will be a public process on the application. So Jennifer, my question to you is that what do we need to do to get, Chair Bernard mentioned having an explicit use for government and for nonprofit entities such as churches. What do we need to change to get there?
Just in the motion, you change it, right?
Right. I'm thinking it probably will go in the definition, and I don't want to try to craft the exact wording here, but essentially you need to tell me. I heard different things. I heard county-owned, I heard government-owned, I heard churches, now I just heard nonprofit. So we need to know what do we mean? And I think you're talking about the ownership of the land that the project would be sited on, correct? Right. Okay, so that would need to be in the motion. And then I think we're still waiting for, I don't know if you want to change anything, but the other issues we raised was the residents under the age of 18, what you want to do about that. And if you're satisfied with the sunset clause at 2 years or 3 projects, and we will need to refine the language about the 3 projects to be more specific.
So really, all we can just say, as recommended by the Planning Commission with these.
Correct.
With the amendment. So,
yes.
So,
yes.
County.
So I move to approve ZDO 267 as recommended by the Planning Commission, but with the following changes. Number 1, we cannot limit the age discrimination, so I wish to strike that. I wish to make that either government-owned and or nonprofit.
Make it county-owned.
I'm sorry, county-owned and nonprofit nonprofit agencies only. Were there any other concerns?
That was it, right?
No.
I think that's it.
Yep, I think that's it.
So I don't feel comfortable moving forward without knowing what ability to regulate any transitional shelter has, and we just don't have that information. So I would really propose that we look at that and we bring this back. And I can't even tell you the nightmares when you're dealing with certain vulnerable populations and the challenges that government entities have to regulate. And I don't want us to be in a terrible situation. So I don't feel comfortable moving forward without that very important question being answered.
And I understand your concern, and I think we're not talking about not moving forward. We're talking about, again, timing and answers to questions. That's how I see this.
Yep, I don't feel comfortable changing the zoning regulations when it requires that H3S, this recommendation from the Planning Commission puts a lot of authority in H3S and being involved with any site, and I don't want the government to step in now without assurances that we can deliver on how to protect people in these situations.
I can make an amendment that addresses that. I was actually thinking about that. I didn't verbalize it, but being that there was a time issue here because you need to get away. What I would want to do is maybe I proposed or thought of changing is make it as it mentions the planning or the Health and Housing Uses Director with consultation from the administrator, the county administrator. So I would add those three words with consultation from the county administrator, 5 words, as assurances that all those things will be monitored and addressed.
Well, we can either vote on this or just.
So that's my motion with that last piece. Is there
I'll
a
second. And let's keep in mind, all we are talking about at this point is the zoning ordinance. The issues, particularly that Martha addressed, and quite eloquently, will get addressed when a site is being specifically discussed. And that's where I would hope that her invitation to others are at the table so that those concerns are addressed at that time.
I would suggest that gets set up sooner than later.
Yes.
Okay, so the motion and a second. Any further discussion? Council, that's not your light.
Just a clarification. So I heard county-owned property. Are we also, just to clarify, we're also talking about component units of the county development agency, other, again, legally distinct entities that are under your purview? Okay, we'll make that clarification. And also, just something to think about, I suppose. Planning did kick back and forth the idea about this nonprofit and having nonprofits be sort of one of the identified entities that could sponsor one of these projects. The issue that was identified by planning at the time was that being a nonprofit is a fairly easy process. Anybody can apply and be a nonprofit. And so if your intent is for there to be some control, some familiarity with these types of operations, I would advise that you at least think a bit more about tightening that condition.
Churches as a
well,
specific.
There's of course particular issues associated with providing benefits for and discriminating, for that matter, against churches. So I don't know if that necessarily solves the problem or creates an additional one, but I think you can all appreciate what the issue is.
Well, I think somebody reminded me of the Rajneeshis.
Well, you know,
they were a nonprofit.
Well, being that there are not churches in industrial areas, I'm willing to just to drop that piece.
Okay, let's drop that piece.
Are you okay with that?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's just drop that and keep it county-owned.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, any further discussion? Well, then we'll vote on this issue. All those in favor say, well, maybe you should take a roll.
Take the roll?
Yes.
Okay. Commissioner Humberston?
Aye.
Commissioner Fisher?
No.
Commissioner Savas?
Aye.
Commissioner Schrader?
Reluctantly, I think the timing is not what I would prefer right now with other stakeholders. I support this project, but I'll join Commissioner Fisher in voting no, because she supports it too. I think it's really a timing issue.
Chair Bernard?
Well, I'm going to vote yes for this, but I'm totally going to support you working out some of these details, because this is not site-specific, and all those concerns are a reality. So, yes, motion passes 3-2, and I just need to read one statement, which I believe this is it. No, I've lost it. Oh, I'm sorry, maybe you stole it. Okay, now that the amendments have been approved, I'll direct staff to draft an ordinance reflecting today's decision and including on an agenda for adoption at a future business meeting. So we've moved it to a business meeting where other amendments could be made? No, okay. But some of those other details could be discussed and considered, right?
That's correct. Typically, we don't have any public testimony at that time. That business meeting is purely for the purpose of adopting the ordinance and making any typically housekeeping changes to it.
Well, we can make some changes.
You can make some changes if there are any substantive changes. It's been traditionally your practice to open it back up for public testimony, but that's certainly up to your discretion.
Okay, great. With that, I'll close the hearing on ZDO 267. Thank you.